Okay, thank you everybody for having us. I am aware that this mic is for ECAT, and so it's not going to amplify my voice, so if anybody can't hear me, please let me know. That's also true of my co-presenters here tonight, so if you can't hear any of us, again, just let us know. I would like to, first of all, thank the members of the committee. We received a great number of questions, data points that people were looking for, and it cut out our work for us. And so I hope you will own the responsibility of the length of the presentation and bear with us. We did, because we are teachers, we did put in slides to demarc different sections. So at any point when we get to one of those and you feel like it's necessary for a break, Chair, please let us know. We're completely flexible and we're happy to do that.
Will do. Thank you.
I appreciate all of the interest in the budget. We regularly beg people pretty much to come to school committee meetings and to town meeting to hear about it. So it is actually something that we are very pleased to have an audience and to get these active questions. And so we're very thankful for that. I also want to let you know that we finished this presentation, which still is in development, about 7 minutes before we got here. So we have just tried to put in as much of the information you requested as possible, as well as orienting or contextual information. And so that's why there is a lot. I am going to beg forgiveness as a recovering English teacher in advance. I am aware there must be some errors in either the formatting or punctuation. I know I have two numbers transposed that I need to tell you about. Please forgive us. We will give you a final version. The reason it's not in your packet, this is sort of our draft because we thought that content was more important than the looks of it and the presentation, and that is not our usual MO in the education department. So I have to put that out there for all of our good sleeping tonight. And then I also want to thank my team. We had to do this together, as we do everything, but this was, as you noted, we're certainly not complaining. We are actually excited about this, but it was a good deal of time in every department. But everyone is not on the committee. I asked them to help prepare information, and when I said, would anybody like to come and present with, they all showed up.
That's
so
awesome.
I am extremely grateful for this team. Easton is very lucky to have such dedicated people, and I think you're going to see in this presentation that holds true for every person in the department. The reason we are getting the things done that we are getting done is because of the people that we have, and I want to punctuate that now, in the middle, and later. Please understand that people are doing some extraordinary things for your children. So I am going to begin the presentation, and I'm going to have colleagues come in and speak to their areas of expertise. If there's a clarifying question, because we have a slide that's not clear, please let us know. We are used to being interrupted. As I said, we've all been educators, so we want to make sure that you understand what's happening. If there is something that we know, having worked on this together, that is coming later, we may ask you to wait for the graphic for that. But please write it down, because if we forget or skip over your question, we want to make sure we answer it before we leave, or that we get it by the next meeting. And there are some things that we just didn't have the data. Dozens of the data points that you asked us for don't exist. And so we had to create them. And so we didn't have time to create them all. So I will explain some of that. In fact, one of the things that Andrea Starzewski, Director of Finance, will be discussing way later in the presentation is that we are beholden to a chart of accounts, or basically every single category in our hundreds of lines of budget. We are mandated to follow what DESE gives us as lines. So we don't have the latitude that private corporations or industries or even the town has. We have to present it in a certain way. So while what you asked for is really common sense and makes sense, and we love the way you're asking for it. We don't prepare it that way because DESE needs it another way, and that's just mandated. So that's why we didn't have the data points, not because we didn't have the information, but because we present it in a different way. I'm sure we'll see some examples as we go along. Okay. Just to sort of orient you to the district, we have just embarked on the first year of our new 5-year strategic plan. I think it's important that we start all of our conversations with the fact that we are thinking of these points whenever we do anything, including the budget, including our spending, including our hires, including how we meet with our students, what we provide, extracurriculars, and everything. Our vision is that we want to empower every student and educator to excel, innovate, and thrive within a relevant and rigorous learning environment that's safe, supportive, and inclusive. Through culturally responsive instruction, deep community partnerships, and positive relationships, we strive to nurture curiosity, critical thinking, and resilience, fostering holistic growth and unity for all. And I think you will see in our priorities here that that is what guides us. We have also created our mission and our equity statement. This is the first year that we have a finalized equity statement based in the 4 commitments to the community of examining all systems and practices, having leadership and voice opportunities, having a reflective curriculum, and diverse staffing and community engagement. This is going to be publicized this year to the community, to our staff, it's going to be on our website, and once again, it's going to be the compass of everything we do, so you may be seeing it frequently. We hope you do, and we hope that you will hold us to our vision, mission, and equity statement. Some of the things we provide, I think a lot of people who have been to school think about their experience in school. But there are a lot of things that happen for our 3,500 very unique souls that we have every day that every student doesn't experience, and you may not have experienced as a student. And so we provide a lot of services other than academic programs like general ed, advanced placement, and English language learner services for those students that are multilingual learners. We also have mental health and behavioral services through psychologists, adjustment counselors, social workers, and interventionists for behavioral issues. Extracurricular activities like sports clubs and activities. Health and wellness services. We have medical professionals. We do health screenings. We provide nutritional services, and we have several wellness initiatives. We also transport all of our students for free, and we have specialized transportation for special education students that require it. Technology and digital learning, we have a one-to-one device program, which is a huge inventory of not only devices, but infrastructure and software. Internet access and digital literacy programs. We have a preschool program that's an early learning program, pre-K, that is a special education program. It's for students who are ages 3 to 5. Career and technical education, we have vocational skills, we have career pathways and early college opportunities for our students, and internships and job training at the high school level. And of course, family and community engagement through our PTO and PACs, our parent resource centers, and our community partnerships, which we are abundant in community partnerships in Easton, and we have wonderful relationships with many people that really have helped us to get where we are, especially with the resources that we have, and we're extremely thankful for that cooperation. We were asked about student enrollment per grade level over time. This is a data point of it, but I also have it in a line graph. You will see that it fluctuates, but mostly it seemed to take a dip around COVID, but we see that there is a recovery since COVID. Where we're seeing the biggest increase, this is all schools over time, we're seeing the biggest increases or growth in pre-K to 2. that it shouldn't be a surprise. It's part of the build it and they will come philosophy. People are moving to Easton to attend the Blanche James Elementary School. That will have a ripple effect through all the grades, which is a fabulous thing for our school and for our town. Something we worked very hard to achieve for this exact purpose. Yes.
In the previous slide where you saw all the grade levels, this is a perfect example of where we were working up until the last minute. I'm sorry, one more slide. I'm sorry, one more. Actually, yes. In the updated version that did not make this slide, that pre-K numbers are in there as well. So I just wanted to note that. In the one that you have. So that's where you see the line at for Blanche James PK to 2 is going up a little bit. That's inclusive of the PK numbers as well.
Thank you.
Yes.
Budget overview and process. Andrea?
Thank you, Dr. Cabral. So for the first couple of slides, as part of the budget overview and process, I would like to highlight the graphic that is before you. Within this pie chart, it's a representation of our fiscal year 24 and 25 budgeted numbers. We have several high-level categories for how our chart of accounts breaks down some of our expense sections or areas. The largest portion that we have is our salaries and wages category. I just wanted to highlight that. That is 82% of our total budget. For those in the public and for those that are not familiar with the way our school department is structured, that varies a little bit differently compared to some other industry categories. 82% is an astounding number compared to other municipalities I've worked for and in private industry, where the personnel costs can range anywhere from 25% to on average about 60%. So I just want to make sure that the public is aware of what our Easton Public Schools is comprised of as far as staffing. We have more than 600 FTEs. So the next category, if you can go back just one more slide. Can you just define FTE? Yes, so that is full-time equivalent unit of personnel. So one body, basically, as far as we consider personnel costing. So for that yellow shaded category, purchases of services, about 15%. That represents most of our vendor contracts, transportation, miscellaneous services across the district. Then we move into materials and supplies, which is about 2.1%. And then that last chart is a category called other charges, which is only about, actually I don't have the figure here, but I will pull that up. As far as the percentage, it's a negligible percentage. I believe it looks like 0% when I have it called out in the pie chart, but that is in-state travel, some professional memberships for our district. And then just as far as salaries and wages go, that's for the actual quantity of the 82%, that's $40.8 million. Purchases of services is $7.5 million, and materials and supplies is $290,000. And then can you move on to the next slide, please? Thank you very much. So this, yes, pardon me? 0.6%. Okay, thank you for the math. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. So for this graphic, I thought it was important to highlight as part of our fiscal year 25 salaries, what is considered collective bargaining agreement salaries versus non-collective bargaining agreement salaries. So as far as our different union agreements, that is 86.9% in salary and wages and 13.1%. So our non-CBA consists of different positions such as our ABA techs, our BCBAs, some of our central administrative staff, and I'll get into a little bit more detail. I can get into a little bit more detail from like a listing perspective if the group would like to see that in the future for what that looks like. But I think it's important to highlight just the mix that we have as part of how we're set up in the school department for our structure. And I will now hand this off to Dr. Cabral.
We thought as a team that it was important to help people understand our budgeting process every year. We've used the same process for almost all of the years that I've been the superintendent. It is a distributive process. It's taken us a while to get better at it because it's not something that people were familiar with or really even expecting at first. And so I think over time, more and more people have gotten involved in it, which is exactly what our point is and why we're looking to have every last person in the district involved. We start, of course, with our strategic plan, which is always our core. And then in December, usually, so it will be December this year that we'll be preparing for town meeting in May. We start with staff input. So the principal team is our leadership team. We meet with all of the principals and assistant principals, and they spend 2 staff meetings, either January and February or February, March, if we're falling behind. But typically January and February, they spend 2 staff meetings with all staff to discuss the strategic plan and where are our gaps? What resources do we need to help us hit our targets, hit our goals as a district? And they provide their input, they prioritize their input, and the principals then in February, usually late February after the February vacation, they come and they present to the leadership team what it is that they feel their schools need based on the staff input to help us meet our targets and our goals. Those presentations help us as the executive team review it at a district level. District, we have the viewpoint of not just the operating budget, but we also have the viewpoint of any grants that we have, of our revolving accounts, of different revenue sources. And so we take that information and we prioritize across the district based on no dollar figures. We're working simply on our current level of need. And so we take that information and we bring it back to the principal team in March, and we present to them. And we say, this is what we heard, this is what we see, this is how we've prioritized the budget, give us your input. And then they may take an opportunity to say, well, maybe I wasn't clear enough about the need for this. Maybe I would like the team, meaning all the principals and all of us, to prioritize this for this coming year, and maybe this we can put off in another school on a different year, because our budget is a big family, and so we have to make sure that we're allocating funds across the schools every year. We then come to a final estimate, we quantify it, and we send it back with the principals for them to share with their staff, so that they get a final look at it, and we ask the principals if there's any final feedback or questions or anything. I have had staff meetings or a budget meeting in the past where I will answer any questions. There weren't any questions this year that came to me, so we didn't hold the staff meeting, but the principals bring the information back to us as that conduit of communication. And then we begin our public presentations. At this point, we need to start quantifying what these needs are going to cost. And there are some that we try to find as many alternative means of funding as possible for them. For example, if it's goods or services that are over $25,000 with a useful life of more than 5 years, we try to apply for capital. If it is a request that falls in the realm of the CPA, we try to approach the CPA for assistance. We know that our operating budget is not going to pay for all of the things that our staff, our professionals are telling us that they need in order to close our achievement gaps and help us meet our intentions for our students. So we then pare it down to when we have our first meetings at the town with Connor and Wendy, and we come in with a number that we know is never going to work, but we try. And the town does the same thing. And you see that in what's called the first budget memo every year from Connor that he puts out. It always has a deficit because all of the things that people are requesting are very much needed and very important. And so we start there. And then from there, it kind of goes backwards until we get a balanced budget. And it's never fun and it's never easy, of course, but that's fiscal responsibility. And so we do that every year. The public presentations include presentations to the school committee. By law, they have to vote on the budget. Then it goes to the select board presentation, FinCom presentation, of course, town meeting, multiple public presentations. They've all been recorded and they all start with this. So I apologize for those of you that have seen it 100 times. This document is what we use as a school department to define our targets. I'm going to spend a little time on this. I hope you don't think we're going to spend this much time on every slide, but this is we're going to use this vocabulary throughout the presentation. So I think it's important for us to orient you. We have reactive and essential needs, which are the base. They're on the bottom. Those are the things that staff brings to our attention that they're only a reaction to a current need or a mandate. They are not even going to fully necessarily satisfy that need or mandate. They are things that we know the Department of Education is citing us on because we're either not providing enough resources or we're not providing enough professional development. There are many data points of minimum spending that DESE has for a school district, whether it's professional development, it's special education. There are many data points that we need to meet from a regulation perspective. Reactive and essential are those things that we are either...
Did I do that?
I don't know. It's okay. It's fine. Like I said, we're teachers, we punt constantly. It's fine. Those are the things that are already a problem. What I mean by a problem is either we have given a limited amount of time to rectify the issue. It is a mandate that has been put in place and we've been given a specific amount of time to meet the mandate. It's a regulation or reporting or compliance that as a district we have to put in place. It may not even necessarily be anything at the school level. And so that's why a lot of the things that we put in place are, we put in place district imperatives as well as the staff imperatives. Because there are some things that the staff doesn't need to deal with because they have so much on their plates already. Those are what go in reactive. Proactive, and I'll just give you an example of reactive. For example, you're going to hear later about our multilingual learners, our students that speak many different languages, or students for whom English is not their first language. There are service hours that are mandated by the state that we provide for those students in directed instruction by a certified EL teacher. The state calls it EL, we call it ML. We are not meeting that. So in order to fill that, we need to hire EL certified staff. We can't hire all at once all that we need. So for example, an EL staff person has been on our list of reactive needs for several years. We were able to hire one this school year, but that's why I say it may not fully fund the mandate or satisfy it because it's one. It doesn't mean, oh, ELs are fine now. We have all of the service that we need. So I just want to make sure that's clear. The next is proactive. This is when we're preparing for an imminent or developing need or mandate. Obviously, lack of preparation in this area just moves it down to reactive in upcoming years. An example of a proactive need would be, we know that there's legislation currently in the pipeline for free pre-K education for all students. We charge tuition right now. We have to or we can't run the program. We have to have a plan for when that comes because we can't shift to free pre-K in 1 year. It's cost prohibitive for us. So we have to think of a way to slowly move in that direction. That would be a proactive. Another example is there's legislation also pending on every student in high school taking courses in computer science before graduation. We have one computer science teacher and 1,100 students. So it's impossible right now. We know it's coming. We don't know when it's coming. We can't prepare for it in 1 year. It's something we have to move towards slowly. Strategic is planning for the challenging and evolving needs of future career and higher education. It includes staff and or resources that students and peer communities already access. Strategic is almost a misnomer. Strategic are things that other districts are providing their students that Easton is not. We have evolved a great deal, but most of it has been through cost-neutral initiatives or cost savings initiatives. What we haven't been able to do is advance in the way that other districts and other districts around us have done. An example of that is foreign languages before 7th grade. We have a small exploratory for 6th grade students. Neighboring districts have students starting as young as kindergarten or 1st grade. That makes a huge achievement difference by the time a student graduates from high school, especially now when we're in a global economy and a flat world, and people are dealing with people from all over the country. It just sets up a different level of readiness for students. Unfortunately, we had one year, a few years back, where, well, first let me just say that since I've been here, this is my 12th year as superintendent, proud superintendent of Easton, we have been in reactive or essential every year that I've been here. We've never been in proactive. One year, we had to move to regressive, and we did have layoffs and elimination of positions. It was literally off the chart, so I had to create what we call the regressive category. So that's what you will see now, because it was necessary. Hopefully it won't be necessary again, but it was necessary. We had to reduce or eliminate staff and resources. It restricts our programming, obviously. It sends the district backwards, because then we have to build that up before we can move on. We have not been in a proactive or strategic budget yet. I added innovative as well, because our staff is among the most talented educators and service providers I have ever worked with in 35 years of education. And I was getting questions from the public about the definition of strategic, saying, well, you know, that's kind of pie in the sky. Do we really need to go there? And I realized people didn't realize strategic means what everybody else has evolved to, and we have stayed where we are. And so I added innovative because our staff has the capacity to be innovative, to develop cutting-edge, state-of-the-art opportunities and programmings that prepare students to be among the top thinkers and creators in a global society. They do have that capacity, and I just wanted to make sure that that was noted. As I said, FY25, I actually use this as kind of a gauge. We are in reactive essential, but we're at the very base of reactive and essential. Giving you an example, we had pre-K and K sections in there. We didn't have to add them, fortunately. We've added, I think, 6 sections of pre-K and K over the last 2 prior years. That influx of enrollment, we didn't know how many kids we were going to get in January or even May when the budget was passed. And so that would have been very reactive. You can't have 30 kindergartners show up without a teacher. The multilingual learner teacher, we were able to add. The EMS AP, we were able to add. And an update is we were able to add a 0.5 EMS school adjustment counselor, which is a social worker. Some of our budget influencers, as I said, the increased PK and ML enrollment, you'll hear about those later. Contractual salary obligations. Obviously, if you have a contract, we cannot the next year say, just kidding, we're not providing those benefits to you. So that is mandatory. That's the first part of our budgeting process every year, is that we roll that over. The increased costs of out-of-district students. Those are the students that we are unable to educate because of their acute needs, either medically or from a special education perspective. And that has gone up. Mr. Davidson will talk about that coming up. We are a minimum aid district. We talked about that at our last meeting. Administrative obligations regarding, we have new discipline and anti-bullying laws that come with a lot of compliance and a lot of legal responsibilities. Transportation contract, it increased 10.7% in this 3-year contract. McKinney-Vento is the transportation of students who are in foster care or DCF custody. There have been considerable increases to that. The same for student support increases and Medicaid optional reporting. Those 3 things, we actually get reimbursements for those because the state has acknowledged this is a crazy increased cost for you, which is really unusual because later you'll see a list of unfunded mandates or underfunded mandates. Those reimbursements, however, go to the town and they don't come to the district. And so many times you'll see that the percentage increase in the budget at town meeting is higher for schools. That's where we have the opportunity to get that money back for the specific purposes of the McKinney-Vento transportation, Medicaid reporting, and the opioid mitigation. And we have grants that are being reduced. It is not the next slide, but it is coming up. So I'm going to finish my part here by explaining how we actually did the budget in real numbers this year so that you have an illustration. The very first thing we do is the 83% of our budget. We roll over staff costs. That was 4.97%. Now, staff did not get a 4.97% COLA. They've historically gotten 2%. However, with step and lane changes, longevity, any benefits that are in the collective bargaining agreements, it comes out to almost 5%. That's just rolling over the staff from the year prior. And then the regressive essential staff that I mentioned, that was 0.47. Very small because we really couldn't develop anything. We're in our very low regressive budget. So we start with 5.43%, which is already more than we've gotten in most years. Then we have the increases I spoke about in operational contracts, transportation, out of district, and so forth. That took us to 8.7%. We have to transport our kids to school. We have to pay for operations. We have to keep utilities in the buildings. That took us to 8%. That was obviously not going to happen, so we had to go back to the budget and think about how we could reduce that percentage to be manageable for the town. We moved some interventionists from our operating budget to the ARPA grant, which is expiring this year. This is all, our technical term for this is kicking the can down the road. I said this when I presented this budget. I'm saying it again. I want to be really clear that this is kicking things down the road for survival this year. We froze some positions for one fiscal year. Positions that were retirements that had lower populations of students, but we know from our enrollment data that more students are coming the next year, so it's only a temporary freeze. We have to figure out something else when we get to the next point. Special education, potential student graduations. What that is students that are in outplaced tuition-based programs. We have a couple of students that are set for graduation. Obviously, these are high needs, high risk students who may not graduate this year. They may need longer to do it. Our programs go up to 22 years of age in order for them to meet that goal, and some of them need it. So that's why I have including contingencies in the title line, because we had to take a leap of faith on some of these numbers in order to get a balanced budget. Potential SPED prepayments, we had not yet rectified the final numbers because invoices and POs still come in even after the teachers are gone, and we have to, Andrea has to reconcile a $50 million budget. And so we wanted to get it to the dollar. We were hoping there would be $200,000 left to prepay special education tuition. We did do that. Additional paraprofessionals funded from a grant. It's called the 240 grant. So we moved paraprofessionals from the operating budget to a grant. We don't know what the grant numbers are year to year. That's very volatile. Special education transportation savings. We were able to negotiate a new contract with a different vendor for a few routes, saved $60,000. And fund some curriculum costs, again, with the ARPA grant. We did have some costs that Connor helped us find ARPA grants that were applicable. They're very specific grants for what you can use them for, and we were able to take that out of the proposal as well. That, including an 11th hour analysis of utilities, because you have to remember our new elementary school just came online and we were just finishing a full year. We had no longitudinal data for utilities projections on that. So that is shaved to the dollar on what came in after a full year of being in the building. And that was $100,000 savings. Yes.
Can I jump in?
Yes, please.
So I think that's a really good point that goes back to a couple of questions that have come up in previous meetings, specifically in looking at like the structural revenue deficit report, where we've itemized some of the things that we have done as a town and as a district to save money, to cut operating expenses, doing things like solar, doing things like utilities. That's reflective of obviously Blanche James being a substantially more energy efficient building than what we were carrying for 3 very antiquated buildings. But it's common and it's understandable for a citizen or a taxpayer to say, these people are listing out all this stuff they saved. Where's the savings? I'm not feeling the savings. And it's important to remember that we have to contextualize $100,000 of cost avoidance there with sometimes hundreds of thousands or millions of unfunded needs somewhere else. And so I think sometimes people may feel like this is some kind of accounting sleight of hand, but it's really important to draw that connection there. And I appreciate that the schools are doing so.
And you make another good point in that we hear a lot, some vernacular about, oh, they're finding money, they have money here, it just shows up. That's an example of something that came in late. We cannot overspend our utilities line and say, well, we're just not going to turn on heat this year. We have to wait until we have a firm number that we know we can afford the heat in the buildings. We can afford the energy, we can afford the electricity. And we can't if we don't have the data to show us. So when people say we find things, we don't find it. We were watching it the whole time, but we didn't know how it was going to come out. We weren't even sure if we allocated enough for it. We were literally guessing based on a couple of months of a very mild winter that was not typical of what we're going to see in the future. So that's part of that comment. Sometimes when people say we find money, that's an example, if you will. If that's found, then that's an example of things that we don't know sometimes until the 11th hour. That brought us to 5.57%, which was our request. I want to point out that what I said prior, a lot of those were on contingencies. This is a list of things. I noted that I didn't want it to look different from prior presentations, so I kept the data there, pre-K and K potentially increasing, but our numbers stayed, fortunately, for this year. So we subtracted that from the total figure. But these are all things that are either expiring from grants or were put on temporary freezes that we have to somehow account for next year if we're going to keep them. For example, the additional frozen sped support positions. That's a program that I mentioned prior. We have internal special education programs. Sometimes when students are moving from one school to another, we don't need the program in that school for a year until the next grade comes. And so when we have a retirement, we don't utilize that staff member elsewhere. We don't fill it. But we know, because we know the students and we know who's moving up next year, that we need that staff next year for the program. The additional interventionists, we put them in. They're not added interventionists. What we did was move more interventionists from the operating budget to a grant that is expiring. The paras, as I told you, our SEA program, that is a wildly popular and very beneficial program that our data has shown has closed achievement gaps for kids in the summer. It's our Summer Enrichment Academy. We don't have that in our operating budget. Our capital facilities requests, we have frozen those for 3 years because our priority right now is something we could never fund, which is security for our schools. And we have to maintain our one-to-one technology program. We can't, they were paid for by federal grants, stimulus funds in 1 year. We can't replace them all in 1 year. We need a procurement plan to do it slowly. So we are only asking barring any emergency that we are not currently aware of, for technology and security in capital for 3 years. That means all of our other traditional capital needs, we either are not doing them or we have to find a way to do them in a cost neutral, cost savings way, because we don't now have the funding for it from capital. Our curriculum materials, I told you, was from a grant. Frozen some positions that, as I said, are going to need to be reinstated. We may need additional kindergarten staff because our pre-K numbers, as I told you, have gone up incredibly. We had a 10% cut on all materials and supplies last year and this year. I don't know if we're going to be able to sustain that. We had to give a number, and we're going to see how we are able to get through with 10% less on our materials. Early college, which is a program where we provide subsidies for underrepresented youth and first-generation students going to college. We tried to pay part of their tuition in an exchange program that we have. That's in a grant. And our work with raising multicultural kids is also in a grant. That $1.79 million is 3.6%. That means we have 3.6% of needs for next year right now in things that aren't going to exist next year. So when we roll over staff for 5+%, this will be an additional 3.6. I don't think we've ever gotten 8%. Ever. Not since I've been here.
And if I could just jump in and remind folks, like the general fund revenue growth year over year is typically in the area of 3 to 3.5%, with the overwhelming share of that being Prop 2.5, which is just the 2.5% statutory increase plus any new growth. State aid's the second biggest. That's coming in at roughly 1% growth per year. Local receipts are the third biggest. Those are growing really well, but local receipts are about 7 or 8 million out of a $109 million budget. So those can grow at 5, 6, 7, 8, 9%, and that's awesome. It can't eclipse this, right? And so I think that's an important point.
To bring a fine point, if I got my math right, school budget is 50% of our expenditure. If 50% of your expense goes up 8 points, that means in total you go up 4 points, everything else held equal. And if we're only getting 3, 3.25, that's the fundamental gap in that particular example we're talking about.
Assuming everything else is zero.
Assuming
You have to tap this to make that.
Does that make sense, everybody? So schools are 50% of our expense. If they go up by 8 points, that means the total bucket goes up by 4 points. If we average getting 3 to 3.5% of revenue. James?
No,
I'm sorry. But you had a
no,
question.
that makes sense. I think that's why we're here, is to figure out what's needs versus wants.
Correct.
Because it's pretty unmanageable to continue to grow at 8% per year.
No, I think what we're saying is there's no way we could, and we all acknowledge that. So nobody's saying 8 points. I think that list is pretty impactful. Hopefully everybody saw the ESSER article that we circulated, and you understand what that means and why that's going away. ARPA, I would argue, is a similar vein of we had it and now we don't. So those are all things. And to your point, James, I think it might be helpful as we go through. Not necessarily today, not live, but yes, like there are state requirements that you have to do those things. Like you have to provide certain accessibility to education. You don't have a choice. You have to provide transportation, so on and so forth. So I think, James, that's a really good point that we should probably tease out as we go through this.
I also want to make sure that people know that some of the articles about the spending and not having foresight that the grants were going to end. We all know the grants are going to end. However, the grants were predicated on the notion that students were out of school for 18 months and that they would get back on track in 18 months. And that is not how children develop, unfortunately. And so a lot of these services, like the interventionists, the C program, and the like, and our mental health counselors, are because our children faced things during COVID that you all know. Things that, fortunately, have not been very prevalent amongst our Easton population in the past, like some other schools have. Whether that is the financial instability in the home, divorce, death in the immediate family, food instability, and certainly the lack of social interaction with the uptick of social media it really created a social and emotional cliff for our kids that we've never seen before. And we are trying to recover from that. We're trying to help our kids recover from that. But it's going to take a lot longer than 18 months. So it's not that we didn't know this was coming. It's just that our kids were not reset automatically. And we have to provide the services they need to be reset, if you will.
Quick question. Of
course.
I just want to make sure I understand. So this list here, this is unfunded, or like these are all things that are.
These are things that are happening this year, but they are not in next year's budget,
happening this school year.
this school year.
But worried about them for the following. School
Yes,
year.
they're not in our operating budget. And so if we were to continue any of them, we would need to move them into the operating budget, which means either eliminating some of these or eliminating things in the operating budget, which is already lean, to put them in.
And how is this list determined? Is it through the meetings you spoke of earlier with all the principals getting together?
Yes, especially for the grants, because they're very specific. And so you have to look at the grants and what can be put into grants,
Okay.
and then look in your operating budget and see what you can move to the grant. This is not a value statement.
Yeah.
And it doesn't mean that these are the first things to go on a chopping block. So that's a great question.
Okay. It's linked
These
to
are things
that can be funded by grants.
Exactly. These are things that are able to be funded by grants. I couldn't put, for example, a fifth grade teacher's salary in ARPA.
Makes sense.
I just have a question. Were any of these items, were they previously in the operating budget, or they've all just been grant funded?
The bulk of the interventionists have been grant funded, because while we had interventionists are certified teachers who work part-time that work with students who have two or more grade levels behind in their academic achievement. And so they work with them to help backfill those skills so they can get matriculated into the gen ed classroom seamlessly. That became, I think we have 19 now. And we started with maybe 6. When COVID came, we added over a dozen, because that need and that achievement gap took a huge dip.
So just to be clear, everything is just has been grant funded, like previously. Nothing was in the operating budget previously?
The special education teacher, special education paras,
So everything without ESSA?
and the capital was in capital,
Okay.
not the operating budget, but it was in our capital requests.
So basically everything that doesn't have ESSA or
Exactly.
Okay.
Oh, well, that's not exactly true, because paraprofessionals were in operating and it says there's a grant next to it.
Okay.
Right.
Okay.
And you'll see in a future slide about Title I, the inconsistencies with Title I and how we were fortunate this year to be able to utilize some of the ARPA funding for that purpose.
Okay.
James?
So is this saying that there was additional, or there's currently pre-K staff and kindergarten staff that are currently funded by grants that are not funded for next year right now?
I
No.
can explain that. with
Okay, sure.
School.
Okay, he can explain that when we get to preschool, but that's why I eliminated them, because we didn't need them this year. We really thought we were going to need them, so that number was over 2 million. But I just kept that so that people know if we have additional pre-K or kindergarten students next year, we are going to have to add staff for them. And so that number is reflective of those two things taken out this year, but certainly next year they could. And I say pre-K and K because those are students that we just don't know that those little humans even exist, right? So we don't know how many are going to show up. And traditionally, parents, especially first-time parents, really don't think about school until maybe like August or July. That's way after. That's way after this budget is done. We have orientation and signups in March for this reason, and we publish it widely, and we try to get everybody to sign up, but we always get the bulk of our students in the summer after the budget has been passed. We could not have any positions in there for that, so if we were going to fund them, it was going to have to come from revolving. And the same thing is next year. If we're going to fund them, it's going to have to come from revolving.
Just one clarifying with base level. Does everyone understand when our fiscal year starts and ends? Just like something that's additional, because it's not January to January.
Right.
We end in July or start in July?
We start
We
July 1st.
end
and
June 30th, begin July 1st.
Which is key to this type of understanding that it says fiscal year 25, which effectively is
School year 24,
year.
25.
24, 25.
Yeah.
Thank you. Sorry, we live in the FY world. Thank you for saying that.
Could we clarify revolving funds for the non-budget?
We actually have a slide on revolving funds coming. Basically, our operating budget, you use it or you lose it. And so if we're allocating funds for our needs for the next year, obviously we're saying that we need that money. We don't have a bank account somewhere. We don't have a year where we're like, wow, we saved a lot of money. Let's save it for next year, which is going to be lean. If you don't use it, you lose it. And we certainly can't go in the red. It's just not an option. So revolving accounts are very specific accounts that can be rolled over year to year because they have revenue coming into them, and they're going to explain them in a later slide. And they can only be used for very specific purposes as well. It's not like a savings account. It must be used for specific needs.
Similar to how kindergarten used to be tuition-based, and now it is not. Is pre-K tuition-based, or does it generate any revenue for the town?
Pre-K has a tuition, but it doesn't pay for the program entirely.
Okay, so now, within the last few years, kindergarten's become a cost for the town, and pre-K is also a cost for the town? And those are
Yes, just
required
like
programs?
first grade and second grade, yes.
Okay, but those are not required to be free or at no charge to the
Do you want to add the clarification on special ed with pre-K?
Sure.
Yeah.
So not exactly, because the pre-K program is a special education program. And when students age in at age 3, which is another compounding factor about eligibility, we don't know how many students are coming in September, and we certainly don't know how many are coming in March. As a child turns 3, we are required to evaluate them. And if they are eligible for special education services, we are required to educate them for free. So we do not charge tuition. We can't. It's not lawful. We also cannot have only special education students. There need to be community peers for every special education student. So as the special education numbers increase, we have to increase the community peer numbers. We don't have a choice.
And the community peers
Are tuition
paying
based.
tuition.
Paying tuition. Does that make sense?
Right, but both programs still cost the town money, I guess is my.
It's an unfunded mandate.
Not the entirety of the program.
Sped specific.
So for kindergarten, I think maybe another way to frame your question, if I could, I think there's legislation that says kindergarten. Does kindergarten have to be
It is
free
not
to everybody?
compulsory, but it is about to become compulsory. And I showed maps. I didn't bring it because I've showed it so much. We were one of, out of 351 communities, maybe a dozen that didn't have free K. And so there's a tipping point where the legislature is going to say, nope, you have to do it. And there's no way we could have afforded it in 1 year.
Makes sense, James. So policy in Massachusetts, essentially, whether intentionally or unintentionally set, that, and I'm looking at a 2021 stat, 92% of communities and cities pay for kindergarten. At that point, Massachusetts legislature gets in and basically looks to make that unofficial policy a policy mandate. That way, kids across the state have kindergarten. Now, good planning says what you don't do is wait until all of a sudden you have a materially large expense pop up in a brand new year, and materially large, and I know I sat in those budget meetings. and
It
you
was
told me this.
almost $1 million.
So you can't, if you look at the numbers we're talking about, waiting until the day that happens, I think is a challenge. So knowing that also extends to pre-K. And I'm only explaining the benefit of being in budget meetings as select board and budget subcommittee, that I know that there's a kindergarten story about like, we're pretty small in terms of the people that don't do it, to the stats we
And-
just referenced.
In addition, as an educator, I have to say, I know this is a financial conversation, but I have to say that it's an equity issue. Because if a student can't afford to have their parents pay, they cannot attend, and they already begin after everybody else. And so, again, it's a question of what does Easton want to offer for their students, and if that's not it, then that's not it. But that is a very important consideration. Kindergarten, when I was advocating for that my first year, so 12 years ago, I did a longitudinal study of students just in full day kindergarten and half day kindergarten. It didn't include any students who didn't go to kindergarten. I used 12 matrices that followed only the students that stayed in our district from kindergarten to third grade. And 100% of the students on 100% of the matrices outperformed the half day kindergarten students. So that is an effect that goes all the way to third grade and beyond. I stopped at the first MCAS assessment.
Dottie?
I just wanted to put a little context around it too from like a non-numbers perspective. So this was a goal for the select board and the school committee for years. And we talked about every year, how do we get there? How do we chip away at it? Because it is a value, it's a community value to be able to do that. And one of the things that was compelling to me is that if you save, if you save a little bit of money on the upfront, you pay for it by third grade, and then you have to bring in a lot more staff to help the kids catch up with it. And so from a financial perspective, that was a challenge as well. But I remember being ecstatic when we were able to meet that goal of being able to do the full day kindergarten. So it was very thoughtfully carried out all of those years, and we used ARPA money to get us over that hurdle. So I think that I just want you to know, like, there were a lot of groups, and I'll speak on behalf of the select board, that we were all 100% on board with that.
Yeah, no, and I'm certainly not against it by any means. I'm just, from a budgetary perspective, that is taking grant money that isn't forever, and now it is a fixed expense.
But it also, like I said, you pay for it now, you pay for it later. It costs you more later.
And just to be clear, Dr. Brock, correct me, but this is no longer being funded through the grant.
Correct.
Kindergarten is in the district
Yes,
operating
that's why
budget.
it's crossed out. Yep.
I think what this is showing is the schools attempting to look into the future when they're balancing a budget in April, saying, well, perhaps we'll have 1 or 2 additional classes worth of young learners coming in. And when I said August, I wasn't poking fun at our community. I'm a new parent, so speaking from experience. And saying we don't have the capacity in the operating budget. So if we do need to meet that need, and it's crossed out because they did not, that would have had to have come from those revolving funds. So right now, kindergarten, I believe, is in the budget.
Yes, as is pre-kindergarten, with the revenue from the tuition that's coming in as well. I also just want to point out that the 3 levers that I discussed with trying to move us to a foundation district, one of them was kindergarten, because you don't get credit for students if they pay tuition. We were only getting credit for half of our kindergarten students, and now we get credit for all of them. So it has bumped us closer to foundation.
Two other people. Sorry, Dr.
Sure.
Cabral. I think Chris wants to make a point, and Patrick.
We're actually talking about full-day kindergarten as opposed to half-day kindergarten.
Correct.
Half-day kindergarten was never paid by the parent.
Right.
It was part of the budget for the schools. It's the full day that we're talking about. It's the addition of the other half.
Correct. This is about day free kindergarten.
Good point, Chris. Patrick?
I don't know if you mentioned this or not and I missed it, but if the winds of change for the pre-K mandate are coming, do you have any insight on what that time frame is, or is it's a finger in the wind still at this point?
It is.
Yeah.
I mean, it's in the legislature right now. You can follow it.
So that could be tomorrow or 10 years from now.
Exactly.
Yeah. Thank you.
I'm betting against tomorrow, but I understand the sentiment. I'm with you. $1.50. Just a time check.
Yes.
This is on us, not on you. Just letting the team know it's 7 o'clock. So we have plenty of time, but just want you to know if you're like, look, I want to get through a few slides, you can let us know that. I'll have that discussion.
Thank you. Yes, I do. So just to tie this up, we talk about the difficulties we have in the town. This is us in comparison to the other towns. And I think this is a very important point. Now, when we talk about comparisons, we use two metrics in the school department. DART is what you see here. DART are the districts that the Department of Education has identified for us that they compare us to, in all of our metrics, including student achievement and our accountability. And you can see that in this bar graph, our per pupil expenditure for FY22, which until this week was the most recent data. They just came out with 23, so I apologize it's not here, but it's not tremendously different by any means. Our per pupil expenditure is $16,635. The state average is over $20,000. And you can see the highest of our people that we are compared against for our performance and our accountability. We are accountable for our performance to the state with much less funds. The other metric we use is our bordering neighbors, and so that's who we have here. We don't have the cities because they're SOA or Student Opportunity Act districts and foundations, so it's very, first of all, they would all be more. But it's not a comparison. We'll never be a Brockton with a $200 million budget. So I only took out Brockton, Taunton, and Stoughton. But with that said, again, we're at the bottom. We are 16,635. Bridgewater Rainham, which is a smaller number because it's just a regional district. So we're essentially the lowest district. And the state, again, is at $20,000. So we are going to talk about student achievement later. I just want you to keep in mind what the staff and your children are producing with this amount of less funds. In fact, if we had the same funding, I did keep Stoughton because it is, it's not like a Brockton or Taunton.
Brockton's on there.
Oh, it is, okay. So I made so many charts. Thank you. I told you it was going to be more, so I wasn't lying about that. So Easton, if we receive the per pupil funding just of the next town, which happens to be Stoughton, not even the state average or Brockton or whomever, because we'll never be Brockton, just the next town up, that would be an additional $5.6 million revenue every year. So we're doing what all of these towns are doing with $5.6 million less every year. Now, if we went with the state average, which when we compare ourselves for achievement, athletics, arts, music, professional capacity, we always shoot above the state because we are above the state in all of them. But if we were at the state level for funding, it would be an additional $12 million a year. And we far outperform the state on every metric.
Is that at the $30 per pupil or the $100 per pupil?
This is the either 30 or 60.
Okay. So still not the newest, most advanced.
No, but that's across the board for everybody that's on that chart, so it would be the same.
Yep.
Connor?
So I just want to highlight, so Stoughton, that's a differential of functionally 10% over Easton. And then the state average you're looking at is substantially more than that, right? You're looking at 23 to 25, Tom will correct me, percent differential.
It's up there.
Yeah.
I think they've said they're good on the percents, so I'm going to hold back.
Fair enough.
And I'm saying state average because we're not a Wellesley. We're not. We don't have the funding that Wellesley does. But we're also not the people that are at the bottom of the list. We're above average. Well above average. Number 34 to be exact.
To be clear, you're talking about on outcomes,
Yes.
On outcomes.
not on spending.
Yes.
No.
No, just want to make sure that's,
Our spending is less than all of those people.
no, I'm just, for folks
Okay.
at home watching.
Thank you.
This spending is not above average.
All right. Wage adjustment factor, I just put this in here just to, again, show the situation we're in. We're at the bottom again. These are all of our neighbors. I mentioned this at our last meeting, and I don't know if people understood what that meant in a quantifiable way, so I just wanted to throw it up here. So, for example, we get the 100% wage adjustment factor. Wage adjustment factor is, we're put in a labor market, and as you can see, ours is the Brockton-Bridgewater labor market. Brockton, obviously, benefits well, much better than we do, and Bridgewater is in a regional district. So we are in the Eastern Triangle, which I often say, that we get 100% of wage adjustment factor, which is a factor that economically, the theory is that where you are geographically is what you need to pay your employees. And so because we're in the Brockton Bridgewater labor market, the theory is we need to pay our staff less than Mansfield, who's second from the top, because they're in the Boston, Cambridge, Newton labor market. Even though we are bordering neighbors, we are very similar in demographics and every metric you can think of. And so for every almost $10,000 we get, Mansfield, for example, is getting $10,500, which is multi-million dollars a year. And so it's not, I don't want people to think it's just about spending. It's about what is coming in as well. Because I would imagine, hey, the question is, well, isn't everybody else facing these same expenses? Yes, they are. But they have more revenue coming to them from things like the wage adjustment factor. This is, by the way, the item that we had asked Senator Timilty to put in Amendment 22 to try to change us to the Boston labor market, and it failed quite resoundingly on the Senate floor. But we are not going to give up.
Could I just ask to clarify? So those figures is that per pupil? Is that per?
That's part of the per pupil expense. But for every $9,967 we get,
Yes.
these towns all get that other percentage.
Right, but so that
Yes.
translates then into 6 or 7 digit impacts because you're talking about that as a factor on thousands.
Multiple seven district digit impacts, yes.
Thank you.
Yep. And we are going to talk about grants unless you want to take a break.
I think we can keep going.
These are just our other funding sources other than operating.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Chrissy Pruitt. I'm the Assistant Superintendent. Thank you so much for having us. Our entitlement grants is often a balancing act when we think about federal funding and the inconsistencies that arise with the entitlement grants. One thing I do want to point out here in these various grants that we do receive regularly is you can see some consistencies with some of our grants and some major inconsistencies. So for example, our special ed IDEA 240 grant, you'll see an increase throughout the years, minimal increase, but still increase. We pay for our paraprofessionals through that. However, if I draw attention to our 305 grant, which is our Title I, you can see just within 1 year, without much notification, we lose $150,000. And again, that actually funds many of our interventionists. I also want to point out that our interventionists in the district service between 550 and 600 students per year, only in grades K through 8. So that's a large population. And when we get to our achievement data, you'll see the need for our interventionists and how important they are within our educational process. I also want to point out that we hover. The way that the Title I and Title II, Title III, Title IVA funding is looked upon is through a federal metrics, and we hover around the 5% mark for low income using the federal metrics, which is different than the state metrics. And because of that, when we are under 5% in any given year, we lose $150,000, for example. When we are over 5%, we increase our spending. Our allocation. And so that is something that's really, it just varies year to year, and we get notification of that over the summer. Those final numbers come out over the summer. Fortunately, this year, we were able to keep the interventionists that we had last year through the use of ARPA. So the ARPA funds that the town had allocated for us. So that's approximately about 6 interventionists that we were able to move into the ARPA grant with the loss of the Title I funding. However, as Dr. Cabral noted before, the ARPA funding is only for this current year.
Where does the state get the data that allows them to know where we fall in these? I think I know the answer, but I want everyone else to hear that.
So it's actually pulled from the census, and it's from the federal government that pulls that because Title I, Title II, all the title grants are actually federally funded. So that is the census, and that's why there's always that big advertisement, that big campaign to make sure that the census, that we fill out and complete the census, because if we don't have those numbers, we see it in our funding.
Can I ask another question just about the ARPA for the interventionists? Is that like going away, or is it something you just have to apply for each year and it re-roll the dice?
So ARPA was provided to the town through COVID funding.
Okay.
And so that is just like ESSER 3, all of our ESSER grants, that is going to be completely terminated at the end of this school year. All right, I'm going to hand this over to Andrea. Oh, did you have a question? I'm sorry.
Just out of curiosity, the 5% for the Title I, how does that match with the communities that we're comparing to? What percent for Norton, what percent for Stoughton? Do you have any idea?
That's a great question. I could make a comparison for the Title I. It does fluctuate, like we said, from year to year. I'm not sure. I'd have to actually look at the actual funding for each surrounding community to see what they receive. So I can do that and get that and add that to this presentation for everyone's purpose, everyone's information.
So I know town administration.
I'm so sorry. I just want to add, our student body, 16% of our students qualify for free or reduced lunch, which again is a federal figure. So those do not jive. I have talked to our legislature about that. I have talked to the Title I grant department at the Department of Education. I've talked to the former commissioner about it. Nobody can help us understand except that they say that the measures they use for the poverty rate and low income are different. We have 16% of our kids that we need to pay for all of their activities fees, their lunch, their breakfast, because they financially do not qualify. And by that, we get a direct certification that informs us who they are. So that means that they are taking advantage and clearly qualify for food stamps, energy assistance, and so on. So they are high needs.
And the other group, the 5%, so you have poverty and?
As the grant, so this is speculation only.
On your part.
As they have a certain bucket of money for grants, they move it to the most needy of the needy. I just want to clarify that we don't have a 5% need rate in Easton. We have at least a 16% rate because we have a lot of proud families that are on the border that will not report or ask for assistance. And so we have a great deal of need that we have to provide wraparound services for, including, helping kids get eyeglasses, helping them get hearing screenings and dental work and so forth.
Just gonna hopefully save you some time because the goal is not to give you work if we can find it ourselves. But I did just look up state of Massachusetts Title I Part A. No expert, but we get about $138,000. The average across all of the communities is $688,000, and it's really heavily. Sorry, we get $138,000. The average across all of Massachusetts for communities is $688,000. But for context, that's heavily impacted by Boston, who gets 42 million, 43 million. Springfield that gets 26 million. Worcester gets 14.7 million. Fall River 8. So you can see the big players get a tremendous amount of funding. We get about 138,000. So hopefully you don't have to do homework. And that's just a good example of, I'll just give another plug. So in the PASE website at the bottom is DESE website, where you can go and see the DART index. You can go and see radar. Haven't figured that all out yet, but it looks pretty cool. But meaning you can go and take any comparison against any communities that you want to. And I would just ask you to do the homework and bring it back to the team if you found something cool. Like, hey, I used the same subset 74 that Connor created at one point and applied it to DART, and this is what I got, and wow, it tells this story. Doesn't mean that DART doesn't apply, but my point is there are tons of resources to go hunt and fish, and we can get our information for ourselves as well.
And even there's a lot of information even on the district profile through DESE. I use it all the time, even though it's nothing that needs specialized instruction on how to use that website. But you can look up any community. It shows you financials. It shows you assessment data. It shows you enrollment, population, exactly, and you can look it up at for any town throughout the Commonwealth. I literally just put into the Google MADESE for DESE district profiles, and then it brings you right there, and you just search by the actual district itself.
Perfect. And I think that gets back to a point that Chris has made, appropriately so. The goal is illumination and education, and that's another way to say transparency. But all of this information that we have access to, that we are being given, we have access to. So just keep fishing, keep hunting, keep asking. That's exactly what this body is designed to do, which is to shed light on the current circumstances. So there's a lot of cool info out there.
I just have one other follow-up question, which is, you said census, federal census, but that's infrequent. That's every 10 years. So is it an estimated association from there?
Yes, it's every the census is once every 10 years,
Right.
but they do estimate what it would be throughout the 10-year process.
And not in advance, so we never know what it's going to be. And we asked for how they do that so that we can predict. And they said that they don't have that in advance and they can't give it to us. So we literally cannot predict that. We find out in usually August, after we voted on a town budget in May, for school that's starting in September.
Thank you.
Okay, so as Town Administrator Reed and Dr. Cabral had hinted at or talked about earlier, our revolving funds, these are the top 5 as far as the current balances that we hold. So we had talked about what a revolving fund actually is. So it is a specific fund, it's outside of general fund or operating budget, where the revenues that are coming into the fund are directly correlated with the expenditures. So we have to spend the revenues down for specific expenses related to the different areas that the revolving fund was actually created for. So for special education, we currently have about $573,000 within that fund. We do currently have 2 employees that are allocated to that fund, so recurring costs of about $140,000. Should we need to tap into that fund in additional fiscal years, one pre-K section is estimated to cost us about $165,000. So as you can imagine, we can quickly expend those funds within just a matter of 2 or 3 fiscal years. So we are cognizant of this as we develop the budget each year for what employees we're placing in those revolving funds. As far as kindergarten goes, we are no longer receiving revenues because we're no longer charging, but there's $247,000 in that fund. Should we need to fund additional staffing out of this revolving fund in the future, one kindergarten section is estimated to cost $95,000 in staffing costs. We also have athletic revolving funds. The revenues that are going into these funds are related to gate receipts, so tickets sales for some of our games, and then also student activity fees. So the students that actually participate in the sports are paying a fee to pay for overhead costs for that particular sport. In no way, shape, or form are those fees covering the costs of the actual program. We're running at a deficit currently for some of our programs within the revolving fund. So slowly over time, if we do not raise those fees, we will spend this dollar amount down that's in that athletic revolving fund. And some of the costs that are coming out of this fund are transportation-related, athletic department software, sporting goods, et cetera. We also are keeping in mind that we do have a large capital expenditure coming up circa 2029 to replace the Moscato Field. Our next account is our facilities revolving account, and that currently has $364,000 in that account. The revenue source for that are facility rentals across our campus. So athletic-related rentals for our fields, different programs that use our different spaces throughout the school, auditorium rental, et cetera. And the different expenses that are coming out of this facility rental are related to repairs throughout the district. We have equipment needs from time to time. The overtime that is actually paid when we do have custodians working some of those specific events for those rentals and our building maintenance software. We also are keeping in mind that within our capital budget, we do not have recurring facilities maintenance costs accounted for over the next 3 years in order to ensure that we have funding for our security project and technology. So if we have an unforeseen need, we expect that we could quickly spend down this facilities revolving account. And then last but not least, our school lunch revolving account, which has $353,000. The revenue sources for this are our federal funding and our state funding for our school lunch program. And currently, we have 7.5 employees that are allocated to this fund, which are our Easton Public Schools food service employees. That $233,000, why I'm saying EPS only, is because we also have operating expenses that are coming out of this fund related to our food service management contract. And we do have staffing through that contract as well. And an example, we do have capital improvement needs from time to time for that school lunch revolving program. An example, back in fiscal year 23, we spent $171,000 out of this account to fund those improvements. And then if you recall, as related to the state funding source for the free school lunch program, every single year, we're waiting to find out if there were appropriations for the actual school lunch program. I know the information that's out there says that this is a free, basically free lunch for all, which it is, but it's subject to appropriation. So each year, as we're looking at the costs for the district for the school lunch program, we are keeping in mind that at any given time, if it is not fully funded, we will still have to pay the cost of the program to run our breakfast and lunch program. So right now, what we worked with our third-party food service management company, for this school year, we actually had a projection. If there was not free school lunch and breakfast, we would run a deficit for the operating budget of the school lunch program of $295,000. If you look at that balance of $353,000, we could easily eat away at that in a given school year if that particular year is actually not funded by the state for that program. So I just wanted to highlight the different balances we have out there and the fact that we're really cognizant of the careful use of the revolving funds to help supplement our any given fiscal year operating budget on an ongoing basis.
Can you tell me what the current student activity fees are? Last time it was increased, and just a little bit about that.
Yes, so right now I believe, and I don't want to misspeak, I believe the fees are ranging anywhere from $150 to $250, depending on whether it's a music program or athletic related program that we're bringing in, and there's different tiers within those programs. But we are evaluating that with our athletic director and our department chair for music to put forth a proposal to school committee to potentially increase those fees. So I just wanted to make you guys aware that we are looking at those fees. Yes, I don't know the exact year for the last time that the fee was raised, but we are looking at that to increase those fees going forward.
I think maybe 2019 is sticking in my head. I think it was pre-COVID, but I think I was on the committee. Yeah, so that'd be 2019. This
Do
has been
you
about, 5
compare
years.
those to surrounding communities?
Yes, we do have comparable data, so we're just making sure that we're falling in somewhere within a reasonable range for what we're charging. But we also consider, we're working with our director of DEIA as well with an equity lens for what the rates are that we would be charging, because we also don't want to prohibit students from participating in different activities across the district.
I also feel like it doesn't give, that we have to look at whether it gives us the bang for the buck. Like if you took that number and you raised it by 10%, that's not going to close the budget gap.
No, it's not.
It's
Not at
really
all.
going to hurt a lot of families. So I feel like that's a trade-off that we have to be looking at. Like,
Yes, definitely. We are carefully considering all of that before we bring forth a proposal to school committee to raise those fees.
So forgive me for a rudimentary question. You say what is 150 to 200, or is that?
So to participate in a given sport for a
Okay.
particular season. So
For
if you want to
Per student.
participate, yes,
thank
exactly.
you.
And we do have family max and caps based off of how many students are in a household. And then also we offer reduced fees if a student does qualify under the school free lunch and breakfast program.
16% that qualify for a student reduced lunch would be the population that would not be charged the student fees, for example.
Correct.
So when you're increasing whatever the math is the remainder of the 16%. But it is a population that is taking advantage of a very specific opportunity. So if you're given a choice to lose that opportunity and maybe to pay slightly more, that might be the difference.
I was just going to say, in addition to Dottie's point about considering whether a 10% increase is really going to help us, we also should remember that those fees do not entirely pay for those programs.
Right.
There is tempo for the music program, there are boosters for the sports, there's significant amount of money that the community is putting in other ways through parent organizations and through fundraising. Those fees in no way completely pay for those activities, so.
My question just goes to like the free school breakfast and lunch. With the projected like potential loss of over 200, is that because we would want to maintain free lunch, or we would go back to the pay, like the students pay as they go, and it would just be the 16% that would qualify for the free lunch?
Yes, exactly. It's back to normal. I'm not going to call it normal participation, but what it was pre-COVID. So students who are not marked as free or reduced would have to pay for their meals. I also believe that there is reduced participation in the program as far as purchasing their lunches. So then, of course, if students are purchasing less, we have less meals that count as reimbursable as far as what state funds we would qualify for too. So it's kind of a catch-22 when we go back to paying for each meal.
I just wanted to clarify that.
Thank you. Are there any other questions before I move on to the next slide? Okay, thank you. So I want to highlight, Dr. Cabral did mention earlier, as far as our fiscal year 25 capital requests and what the next 5 years look like. Once again, we are dedicating, and the town has allowed us as well, as far as what we've put forward for a request for security system upgrade, where we are focusing on our schools, Oliver Ames, Easton Middle School, and Richardson Olmsted, to make sure security systems are upgraded to be on par with our new school, Blanche Ames. And then for technology, a standard allocation of $200,000 in order to maintain some of our equipment and our one-to-one Chromebooks, but that no way, shape, or form covers all of our technology needs across the district. I believe historically we had included about $250,000 in requests. That was not covering all of our needs, but we're putting forward a request with the notion that we want to focus on that security system upgrade. If I could draw your attention to the 5-year capital projections on the right-hand side, as you see fiscal year 25, fiscal year 26, and fiscal year 27, like I said, we're focusing on security upgrades and technological needs. But then when we move into fiscal year 28 and 29, we hope to ensure that we have some of our capital maintenance needs met within our requests for RO, OA, and EMS, and some standard equipment. We've historically included some dollar amounts for furniture replacements as we see fit. But just keeping in mind when we talk about the revolving funds, once again, if something does come up from a maintenance perspective, we could easily be looking at a $100,000 request, $200,000 request, and wiping out that facility rental account. Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to turn it over to Assistant Superintendent Pruitt. Thank you.
So this here is, over the years, we've implemented numerous cost-saving measures, and this is just a sampling of some that we have brainstormed in the process of creating the slideshow. There are many more. From optimizing special ed programs, you can see streamlining technology platforms, centralizing printing. We've made real strategic decisions to reduce costs while maintaining high-quality services. We've also adjusted fees, as was pointed out, utilized partnerships, and implemented energy-saving initiatives. Our focus on internal professional development and efficiency in purchasing processes ensures that we maximize resources while minimizing unnecessary expenses. We really remain committed to exploring additional ways to save and ensure long-term sustainability in our district. And I want to point out, too, that many of these costs are, I keep going back to the picture at the beginning of the presentation of the pie graph of that smaller portion that are not salaries, right? And so these are all the measures that we are taking to reduce and save in that portion of the pie. You'll often hear around central office and throughout the schools the term unfunded mandates and underfunded mandates, because this is a reality in our world in education. We have each year, the school department faces numerous unfunded mandates from both the Massachusetts Department of Elementary and Secondary Education, which we refer to as DESE, as well as the U.S. Department of Education. And it requires compliance without additional financial support. So these mandates come with many annual deliverables that we need to provide, which add pressures to already tight budgets. On top of that, the Massachusetts Department of Elementary and Secondary Education puts out a superintendent's checklist with an additional 120 mandates, compliance-related required actions each year. These regulations aim to improve education, but they often strain our resources drastically, and we must meet these expectations without additional funding. This year in particular, well, this year and last year, we are really fortunate to have our Director of Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Accessibility, Carol Perez, on our team, as she has been able to look at this. She has a law background, which is really helpful. And she is really wonderful at helping us really navigate through the legalities of many of these compliance issues, and has been able to guide us and look through our reports as we report to the state and federal governments. I also want to point out that she, in particular, is in charge of bullying throughout the district, and there has been a new bullying unfunded mandate that requires a lot of paperwork that needs to be filled out as well. The bullying report alone, so whenever a parent or a student says that their child is being bullied, the bullying report alone is 6 to 8 pages that an administrator has to stop what they're doing and obviously, for obvious reasons, fill out that report. And Director Perez has been wonderful at helping guide our staff through that, because we want to make sure that the laws are being met and that we are really making sure that we are following what the mandates are requesting and requiring of us. Many of them are tied to legal action. Do you want to add in?
No, the only thing I'll add to the savings is to just remind you that this is the smaller part of our budget, right? This is the less than 20% of our budget, but we're doing everything we can. There's no savings to be had here in terms of, when we say centralized printing, what does that mean? That means Chrissy and I and our assistants, whenever we print anything, we walk down the hall to go and get it, hopefully before anybody else sees it, because it's usually confidential. So I'm not complaining about that, but I just want you to understand there's not, some cushy things going on in our departments. Same thing with teachers. Teachers, they cannot print in their classroom. They have to go to centralized printing. Like, we are down to the granular level of rates of our facilities rentals. We're also evaluating that right now, because that's this part of the budget, and we are at the granular level of that. We are going to talk about students next, but this is potentially an opportunity for a break, Tom?
Yeah, that sounds good. It's 7:35, so how about we give 10 minutes and start back up at 7:45? If ECAT could take us off the air, I would remind everybody, these microphones are very sensitive. So there's red light is on, which is excellent. Thank you, everybody, for taking the quick break and getting back timely. And we can pick up where we left off on student information.
Can I ask one savings question before we jump to student information? Solar panels on BA, I know it was listed on there as like a soon. Do we have a time frame for that yet? Or is that just sort of, that was a knowing look? Did I? Never mind, guys.
Oh, no, we are working on that as quickly as we can. It has to line up, obviously, with the school year, but there's also shifting regulatory
That's what I was gonna
considerations from both a state and federal perspective. I think I vaguely recall our energy expert talking to me about that before going to finance committee and me saying, I don't think anyone's going to ask about the overlap between these regulatory schema, and then you did, and that was fun. But we are working through a pilot program with National Grid to try and make sure that there's a way for us to get there.
Okay. Thank you. I figured it would come up.
Thank you, sir. Please.
Okay, thank you so much. So this next part of the presentation is we're going to look at our student information. We're going to start off looking at our multilingual learner requirements and that population. You'll hear a few terms that are kind of synonymous in the sense. Multilingual learner is a term that we are moving towards as a state. We in Easton are mostly using that term because having a child that speaks multiple language is really an asset, and multilingual learner is really looking at a child from an asset-based perspective rather than a deficit, where English learner tends to have a deficit perspective. However, with that being said, you will hear the terms English learner, you'll hear the term English language learner, and you'll hear the term EL teacher. Those are all kind of around this population. There are many laws and acts and that govern how we educate our multilingual learners. I have had the privilege in some of my coursework towards getting my doctorate in really diving into these laws and a lot of the acts, really to see how we can do better for the students that we serve. This is, Massachusetts is definitely at the leading edge of how to educate our students that speak multiple languages. So these are some of the laws. You can feel free to look them up and dive into them. There's a lot of research around them. There was one that's not on here because the Look Act took over for it, was the UNTS initiative back in the 90s. That was adopted in Massachusetts, which made students in Massachusetts, multilingual learners in Massachusetts, they had to be fully in English language, in English classes. The Look Act kind of counters that, but it's some great research. I'm kind of, I won't get into that now during this presentation, but it is great. Yeah, it is really great research to look into and to see some of what's out there for us to look at. So with that in mind, the Massachusetts Department of Elementary and Secondary Education do have specific guidance on how much service we should be providing our multilingual learners. What happens is our multilingual learners are categorized through a test called the Access Test, and it tests a student's proficiency level. What happens is your level 1 is those of us that have the smallest amount of English proficiency, and level 6 is the highest. At the point of 5 and 6, they're considered our former English learners, and I'll get into that in the next slide. But they don't receive direct instruction. Okay, but I want to show you here that the guidance just changed in 2024, where our access levels students 1 and 2 are to receive they say recommended periods, but they really are what we aim for because that is best practice. 2 to 3 periods, which are not less than 45 minutes each, of direct ESL instruction delivered by a licensed ESL teacher. And then our transitional students, which are level 3 and 4, they are, it's recommended that they receive 1 period of 45 minutes of instruction. when you look to the chart to the right, you'll see the difference in just 5 years. You know, we've seen 6 years. We've seen our population more than double in this area. And one thing to point out too is that when I say that there's 38 level 1 students, our foundational students, actually 60, and I just want to point out that this is a casualty of the last minute edits. That number 170 is really 180, so that was a miscalculation, but that is on the updated version. You'll notice that when I say the 38 or the 60 levels 1 and 2 that require 3 periods of 45 minutes of instruction a day, they're not all in one school. They could be in 12th grade. Some students could be in 4th grade. You know, it just depends. So I can't say let's have a class of 38 students to get 3 periods, because they're scattered throughout the district in all grade levels. I also want to point out that our pre-K students, we do test our pre-K students, and those students do not receive direct instruction currently because of the service requirements and the staffing that we have, and it isn't mandated. So because there's such a high level of language instruction at the preschool level that our EL teachers do consult with our preschool teachers, but there isn't direct instruction currently going on. If you go to the next slide, one of the things that we did calculate is our current number of students that do receive direct instruction, of how many required hours per year each student should be receiving. So for our levels 1 and 2, you'll see per year they should be receiving 405 hours of direct instruction, and then 135 for our levels 3 and 4. You'll see the calculation of the population that we currently have, that they should be receiving 33,480 hours of direct service a year. We have 6 teachers throughout the district to fill this.
Is that dedicated to English language?
Dedicated to EL students, but across all 4 schools. And I do have the breakdown at each school. However, sometimes it gets very identifiable, so that's why I'm not sharing it out today. But we do have that, and we do look at where our populations and where the biggest needs are.
Are any of these levels exempt from MCAS testing or other mandated testing?
They are not.
So that's additional resources for
Yep.
teachers to make sure that they are brought up to
Correct.
the level to do those tests.
Right. And I also want to just share that, you know, a student with a level 1 proficiency at the high school level, to educate them, it's very different than educating a kindergarten student with level 1 proficiency level. Excuse me, specifically because of their age. We also know that language acquisition, conversational English you learn conversational English much quicker than you learn academic English. And academic English can take up to 6 to 8 years to learn. And at our high school level, when we receive a student that is at a level 1 proficiency level, we only have a few years with them to get them to reach that higher proficiency level at an academic level, and that's what this proficiency level is testing. If you can go to the next slide, please. One of the things that's really important is that our former multilingual learner students are the FELs, the former English learners that we had noted, the 52 that we currently have. There are all these requirements that our our EL teachers still have to do in order to for our students. So for one example is we monitor them for up to 4 years, for at least 4 years, to ensure that they haven't been prematurely exited. There's regular observations that the teachers need to do on these students. There's also collaboration. They have meetings with content teachers to ensure that they are getting the supports that are needed, and many other things that are up here. I'm not going to read this to you, but this is really important to note. Let me just look at my notes here. Okay, I think that's all I have for our multilingual learners at this time. Connor, did you want to?
So I don't want to put you on the spot, but going back to that slide of if we took, are those DESE recommendations as far as the amount of
Yes.
basically
Yes.
class instruction? So we have 6 FTE, that's obviously mathematically impossible to achieve.
Right.
If Easton Public Schools were to hit that, how many more FTE would need to be devoted to that? Do we know roughly? So instead of 6, is it?
Well, and we also calculate that we can pull a group of students with a multilingual learner. I mean, with an EL teacher. So that is calculated into it. I mean, we need at least 4 or 5 more teachers to really scratch the surface of what needs might be.
6 teachers can provide about 5,400 hours of service.
Okay.
Right.
So we're 1/6 of that.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly.
Thank you.
And also, I'm sorry, and also the support that's needed for our students. And again, I'm looking at Marissa, so I'm thinking of the high school, of our students that go at the high school level that are in classes without supports, and also the professional development that our staff needs in order to provide the supports that are needed for our students.
Think of a physics student who speaks no English.
Right.
Two comments. I think, Chris, you had one, and then switch to James.
The hours you're calculating, those are for individual as opposed?
Yes, those are individual.
And do you do classrooms?
No.
No. Okay.
Wait, class. I'm sorry. Can you repeat that?
Classrooms.
Class.
Like
Groups,
groups
no.
within a class,
Yes, we
pull
pull
them out
groups.
into
Yes.
a classroom where you have EL students.
Right. We have 5. We have 5. Yeah, up to 5 students within a group. However, at the high school, I think it's a lot larger at this moment.
Do you have groups?
We do have groups. Yes, absolutely. We have groups.
So those hours could be combined.
Correct. Yes.
So 5 would be service.
Yes.
Ideally, 5 students would be a service.
Right. Ideally, and again, according to schedules and things like that, I'm picturing in my mind our wonderful EL teachers at Blanche James. As I walk by, there's 12 classrooms that they pull from, and at a particular grade level, and coordinating the schedules to make sure that our EL students are not missing our Tier 1. Tier 1 instruction, which is our services that all students get. We want to make sure that they're not being pulled out of that time. It really limits what we can do with the minimal staff that we have. Yes.
Yeah, I just have 2 questions, and it might build off the comments that were already made, but could someone in 12th grade who's an English language learner or a multilingual learner be in the same class as a 5th grade student if they were the same level of learning in that capacity?
No, there are regulations for.
Well, first of all, they're in different buildings with different schedules, but you also have to remember that the 12th graders learning academic language like physics, where the elementary student were using puppets and cards and things of that nature to help them learn basic vocabulary.
There are also regulations within education where we can't have a certain age span between students working in the same classroom. Yeah.
Access 1 might be the same.
Sure. Yeah. But we do try to do that across schools, right? We will try to pull, level 1 students together even if they're in different grades.
And not that teachers would want to. Could they move potentially across? Do they do this already where they move across buildings? Do they host 7 classes? Like each teacher is fully devoted to multilingual learning?
Yes.
They run 7 classes a day, basically.
Yes.
Awesome. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to turn this over to Director Davidson.
Thank you, Mrs. Pruitt. Excited to be here tonight and just share some of the special education data for our district. The first slide you'll see tonight is our in-district special education data, and I gave you a 10-year window from our FY15 to our FY25. FY25 is the current numbers we have as of tonight. So when you look at the landscape of special education within the district and within the state over the past 10 years, you'll see an increase in IEPs within our school district. That is on par with the state average. Back in 2015, it was roughly around 16%. It's hovering around 20% statewide for students that are qualifying for special education services. Our 504s have drastically increased. 504s are students with disabilities, but it impacts their overall ability to access the building and education, where IEPs directly impact their access to the curriculum and instruction. Where we're seeing an increase within the 504 plans is around our therapeutic supports for students and our clinical supports. between individual counseling and just behavioral supports within the building, you can see a large increase over the last 10 years in that area. The next breakdowns are really around full inclusion, partial inclusion, and sub-separate programming. There's been a big push state and nationally around full inclusion models for students. The data represents a higher level of achievement when students are receiving Tier 1 instruction within the educational classrooms. So when they're learning from a high-quality history teacher or science teacher at high school level, they're more likely to have a higher achievement level within state testing. So you'll see that our full inclusion numbers have drastically increased over the last 10 years, and our partial inclusion has decreased. Where you see an increase also is around sub-separate programming. There was a vision around 10 years ago within the district that there needed to be more sub-separate programming opportunities for students to access in the least restrictive environment. It is actually part of the IDEA regulations that we are to provide educational support in the least restrictive to give students the ability to access their educational rights. For us, being able to create sub-separate programming within the school district and also some of our partial inclusion programs, it gives us the ability to educate within. And so roughly about 98.5% of our students within the Easton Public Schools or Town of Easton come to the Easton Public Schools and are educated within our 4 buildings.
Can you define sub-separate for those of us who
Of course.
aren't in the know?
It's a student that that actually participates in their educational day 60% of the time outside of a general education classroom. Students in a partial inclusion are students that could access our programming. They access the programming at a higher rate than 21% of the educational day. So they're receiving direct instruction in secret services where they are in small groups outside of the general education classroom. Where this is important is when we start talking about the cost for educating a student, and this is going to tie directly in with our out-of-district costs. You'll see, before we get to that point, there was a big change from 2015 to 2025 in the way we transported students within the district that need specialized transportation. There's an asterisk next to the 2015 numbers. That number represented transportation costs that we were in charge of internally. So we had our own staff driving vans. We were in charge of repairs. We were in charge of gas for those vans, and so on. You'll see an increase to $463,000 over the last 10 years. We now resource out. Now, if you think about how much the landscape of costs have changed over the last 10 years, that's not a large increase, and you'll see that in the out-of-district costs of how much it's costing to transport students. I broke down a number for you. Our students that are accessing our programming in the least restrictive environment right now, and that cost per student within the district is around $39,600. Where that number comes from is all of our program teachers, our program paraprofessionals, our ABA techs, our BCBAs, our speech and language pathologists, OTs, PTs, clinical staff members that support kids in sub-separate programs and partial inclusion programs. Where that is important is that the students not only are accessing the least restrictive environment, but they're around their peers. They're around the same students that they see around town, they see at the grocery store, and they're able to access our buildings. And it takes a specific level of support within those buildings to provide that education, but you'll see what the costs are for students that are not able to access those supports within our buildings. Next slide. We thought it was very important to share our pre-K numbers, and I know this question came up earlier. There's state regulations around preschool classrooms. If you have a sub-separate classroom, those are students that would access that within one teacher and multiple paras, and only 9 students can be in that classroom. Where our full inclusion model preschool, right now we have 9 sections of that. We have 2 half-day programs, so that's 4 of our sections. The rest are full-day programs. Students qualify based on the level of need for those programs. You'll see the August 1st numbers. We put August 1st because, as Connor mentioned earlier, it gets a little bit larger towards the end of the year, but it's very important to share those numbers. You'll see the growth from 2019 through 25. The reason for that is in the state of Massachusetts, we are responsible for educating students with disabilities starting at the age of 3. There's no way you can close your doors to any student that qualifies for special education services at that time. Where we are a full inclusive model is that we have to have classrooms that operate with 8 peers, typically developing individuals, and no more than 7 students on IEPs. And so when you break down those numbers, we have a roughly 71 spots for students with disabilities to access our preschool programming. We have 1 sub-separate programming and the rest full inclusion model. If there was even a change, and maybe the question earlier was around like what would happen if we didn't have the peers coming, we could only operate with up to 9 students in those classrooms. So we would go from 71 slots to 63 slots. If we are currently at 60 students in our preschool that are students with disabilities and are on IEPs. And so if we ever reverse that number, you can see the growth from August 1st to July 1st of the next year. You can see how many students join us during the year. We currently have a wait list for our peers. We have 12 open slots right now for students with disabilities. If you look at those numbers, our growth has been larger than that every year. And so that's why when Dr. Cabral was talking about how we would access revenue in our revolving accounts to be able to provide another section of preschool, that's why. We would look at it right now as potentially needing another preschool classroom by the end of the year. We thought it would be a cost saving entering this year, and if we have to add a section based on the numbers, we could do that eventually down the road. Any questions around preschool enrollment? Okay. Out of district numbers, as I said, about 10 years ago, the district really focused on creating internal programs to meet the ever-changing needs of our students. Where you see the largest change is how many students were out of district in FY15. We had 51 students out of district. All right. This year, we have 32 currently. The out-of-district tuition cost range, I took where we had one of our students going in the lowest number and where we had one of our students attending at the highest number and created a range for you to see today. If you look back at 15, we were between 34,000 as our low point and 182 as our high point. There's been a drastic change in out-of-district costs over the last 10 years. And I wanted to break it down for you from 2014 to 22 and then 23 to now. Over the period of 2014 to 22, we saw a 16% increase in out-of-district costs, so roughly 2% a year. Very easy to budget around that. It's a gradual increase. In 2023 and 2024, we got slammed with a 14% increase. What that means is out-of-district placements, there are 766 schools that can access state funding, was able to raise their tuitions by 14% with no pushback from the state. That was 1 year. I'm sure it was talked about in your budget presentations. It took everybody by surprise, and it really took some creative thinking within districts and really put pressure on us to start thinking differently about how we educate kids in general. Then we saw another giant increase last year, 4.5 to 5%. This doesn't even count the schools that can actually request OSD to take a look at their buildings and their staffing and their needs, and they can actually get approval for higher rate increases outside of the typical increase. So you'll see, and that's why the numbers don't align, you'll see a tuition of 182 in 2015 at a residential program. That same program that we have a student at this year is $352,000. They've appealed to OSD over the time. You get a higher increase. Some placements might have got 2% 1 year. That placement might have got 7%, based on the level of need and support for those types of students. The next line really breaks down circuit breaker reimbursement. Circuit breaker reimbursement is reimbursement for out-of-district placements within the Massachusetts perimeter that is OSD approved. And so there's 766 schools. If the student attends there, there's a threshold for cost. Last year it was roughly around $52,000. So the first $52,000, the district completely takes on that cost, and that is built in. From there, every year, the state and feds work together to create a percentage of reimbursement back to the districts above the threshold. And so some years it's 75%, Some years it's more, some years it's less, typically 75% above the threshold. The other piece of that is, in recent years, they've started to reimburse for transportation. That has also changed. It started off as 25% reimbursement, 50%, 75%. It got up to 100%, and then it's backtracked since then. The issue with that is every single van company in America realized that that was happening, and they upped their prices. The out-of-district transportation costs, again, we resourced out in 15. We were not providing transportation out-of-district facilities at that time. It was $802,000 in 15. We've been creative since then. My predecessor and now my office has really taken a look at that and how we can pair rides, not only with students within our district, maybe dropping off multiple students at one location, or partnering with neighboring towns to transport students. Our projected cost for this year is $869,000, or close to $870,000 for this year. So you can see we're really trying to be creative with how we budget for some of these price increases that we've seen over the years. Our out-of-district costs for the year and the estimate you can see there compared to 2015. But I think the big change that you can see on that board is the average cost per out-of-district student. As I said, we're basing that number off the 4,816,000 and the 32 students that are out. That is not all of the costs. Some students also receive nursing on the vans or a bus monitor and so on. It's about the level of service necessary. So you can see how important our internal programs have been and how important those staff members are. And so when we start talking later on about where you see an increase in therapeutic staff and nursing staff and special education teachers, you'll see why. A student that previously might have been out of district and coming back is not only are they accessing the community and buildings at large, they are also financially a smart move to be able to educate students within their own walls. Any questions on that?
So if I could, and correct me if I am wrong here, but I want to highlight again, particularly for PASE's perspective, when we're looking at things from a financial perspective, so you're looking at $150,000 per pupil average, but we've dropped from 51 to 32 out of district, and that wasn't just kind of organic happening. That's a result of years and years of deliberate work by the district, which sometimes does include adding positions, right? Because I think that's something people get tripped up on with budgeting, that there's some, not dissimilar to folks looking at ESSER or ARPA and saying, well, those were grants, shame on you for hiring a staff person. It's like, well, the grant said to do so, but that's a kind of secondary thing. Somebody could look at the town's and the school's posture and say, well, you've been saying you have a revenue challenge. Why are you adding anyone averages? Hiring freeze across the board, fixed, right? But this is a really good example where if you take that $150,000 per pupil cost, and had we just stayed steady at 19 higher, even if you net out the, I think you estimated at 40,000 in district, so that's 90,000 per student of cost avoidance times almost 20, so you're nearly 2 million, right? So I just wanted to focus everyone on that, because that's a really good example of times where, without even getting into the important kind of communal or equity matters that you touched on, and on top of this, we get to keep these children here with their peers. That is a huge cost avoidance that the district has planned for and implemented just to be able to kind of continue to make incremental progress given our revenue challenges.
And I think
so good work.
But it's great that we can sit here tonight and present this data, but it really goes back to the teachers in the classroom who day in and day out educate kids the right way. And being able to do that and provide those services necessary and be able to provide the growth that those students and families are looking for, and creating an atmosphere and an environment for them to thrive in is really what's behind it. It's nothing that we do on a daily basis. It's really the educators in those classrooms that are doing it.
Appreciate that. You might be addressing this later, but obviously our goal is to keep students in district. Does Easton offer anything currently that brings in students from other districts? And is that a potential goal for us in the future, that we can then get money from other districts because we are meeting their needs here?
Absolutely. For special education programs that we have right now, we do not accept outside students. We've had people reach out based on students that they have, and they were looking for local school districts to be able to meet their students' needs. But right now, we're not able to do that. If we were going to do that in the future, it's really based on the level of need. And so when you accept a student from an out of district, from a surrounding district, you're really looking at the cost per pupil, and then what the services are above that. And so you would have to hire the staff to meet the level of need for that student. And so it's not really a revenue process. It's really a break-even process to be able to create the least restrictive environment for a student to access a curriculum and a program within a community school.
We have tuition students in, but only when we had space in programs. So we don't underpopulate our programs. If we have student populations that move through and we have a couple of students less in a program, we will advertise to other districts for them to come, because we have to maintain the staff. We keep it full. We have done that in the past. Right now, though, we are full in all of our programs.
And it's not necessarily just looking at the current, if there's one slot open in for this year, because we know that we want to make sure that we have space for them in the years to come as well.
Perfect. Thank you. Quick question. Is the circuit breaker consistent even though we're a minimum aid community? So it's proportional to, it's a percentage to minimal aid?
No, the percentage is not consistent. I'm sorry, is that what you asked?
Is the circuit breaker applicable through 351 communities, or are we at a different rate because we're a minimum aid?
Nope, it's flat across the board. And then you'll see the last slide that I'll present tonight is really our special services revenue. And when you look at it, our SPED revolving accounts from FY15 to FY24 is really around preschool tuition. And you'll see how much we've taken in over those or each year. And that's really based on the enrollment in preschool. Circuit breaker, you see that change. I mentioned that earlier. Around the 240 IDA grants. The 240 grant is based on the number of students on IEPs within your school district. Every single school district receives the same amount of reimbursement through that program based on the students in your population. Same with the 262. That's for students 3 through 5 years old. Both of those are really focused on staff members to meet the needs of the students within special education. And so I think Mrs. Pruitt mentioned earlier, it's really around paraprofessionals in those areas. And there's a very strict guideline for what you can spend it on. It's all about educating students with disabilities within your schools. The 274 improvement grant is a very important grant to see on here. I've now been a director for 7 years, and we've only been able to access this grant twice in the districts I've worked in. It's not an every year grant. This time around, it was focused just on the new IEP rollout. Previously, it was creating a program back in 2015. It was about creating a program within your district that would meet needs of students, but I've only seen it twice over the last 7 years. So it is something that comes and goes, so it's not guaranteed money within the district. So you'll see our total revenues for those for 2015 and 24. On the right, I want to focus on some more revenue opportunities within the town. You'll see from 2020 through 2025, Medicaid revenues that went back to the town was $996,000. The important piece of the Medicaid process is that students that qualified for Medicaid reimbursement are seen by specific staff members within our buildings. The revenue that comes from that are based on clinical notes that the staff members write on those students and provide direct services to those students, and the reimbursement comes back for the Medicaid. The piece that's important here is to note that those numbers can increase over time. The issue is we have to focus as a school district on providing the direct services to the students. So we're capped off on how many students we can actually write the clinical notes on based on the needs of our caseloads. If we increase the staff members within our buildings, we would be able to create a higher level of Medicaid reimbursement to the town, but it's all a balancing act depending on what the direct services are at that time for students. So roughly you'll see OTs, PTs, therapeutic staff and school nurses as the major people that can focus on Medicaid reimbursement. But without more staff members, we can't increase the amount of clinical notes they're providing back to Medicaid. McKinney-Vento reimbursement has been about $140,000 over that time period. We actually partnered and came to a finance committee meeting, I believe last year, Dr. Cabral and I did, and we signed up for another additional reimbursement opportunity through the McKinney-Vento and partnered with the state on it. So we'll start seeing more revenue on that. That is coming out of our operating budget. And so students that are homeless or in DCF custody have the right to be educated in the district that they reside in or did at the time that they were removed from their homes. And so we work within our operating budget to make sure that we're meeting the needs of those students. The reimbursement piece from that process goes back to the town. And Connor does his magical work of being able to balance the budget with the reimbursements that come in. And then the opioid settlement that came back to the town was $665,000 over that time. And I know that that has been creatively used in the past to meet the needs of the ever-changing budgets in town. And
before we go on to student achievement, one of the questions that we received was, can you talk about student achievement, but also are you satisfied with student achievement? And so Mrs. Pruitt's going to talk about that. I am taking the opportunity to orient you that we have gone through 7 pages of 6 slides each, and we have 3 left.
Solid. Hey, great math.
I can do this. There's student achievement.
So while I do really appreciate the question around are we satisfied with student achievement, I will just flat out let you know the answer is no. And you'll see why in the slides to come. Our teachers, and again, to highlight what, give credit where credit is due, our teachers do a phenomenal job with what they have. If you can go to the next slide. I just want to show you that this is, and I'll explain this, this line graph to you, but we have been, prior to COVID, we had remained stagnant with our student achievement level for the 10 years prior. We were very, very stagnant with how we were achieving. Many people, many residents might look at this and say, well, our students do well, they go to college, they get wonderful jobs once they graduate, we are doing well. However, I want to point out that there is much more that we could be doing, and we could see higher achievement levels if we had the resources that our teachers, as Dr. Cabral had stated previously, really looking at what are those strategic and innovative ways that we can educate our children. And I do think that is a decision that the Easton community needs to decide when looking at budgets is what do they want for their students? Is stagnant something that we are looking at? When you look at this data, what I want to point out is the 2020-2021 school year. You will see a dip, and that is COVID. That's our COVID results. And what the state is, what is happening at the state level right now is everything that we are working towards is to get back to the 2019, and underneath it says 2018, 2019. Again, just we can say FY19, fiscal year 19. We are trying to get back to those numbers. So we continuously make improvements, which is great, but we have a long way to go still. You'll also see just a significant thing to note are grade 10 ELA and math scores in 2018, 2019. That was a different assessment. So I just wanted to note that I kind of played back and forth with, do I put those numbers on here? Do I not? But it's really important to note that was a completely different assessment because they changed the assessment. It was pretty much of a bit of an archaic assessment and really just tried to catch up with the critical thinking and problem solving skills that our students are now encountering. And you'll also note on the bottom axis that there is not a 2019-2020 school year in this data, and that is because we did not test. The MCAS was not given because of COVID. So you'll see through this, and I'm sorry, one more is the yellow line, which is grade 5 and 8 science, that's when the new science assessment began. And also the light blue, grade 10 science, that's when the new grade 10 science assessment began as well. So you'll see that we are increasing, but we're not, right? And we're not where we should be. And we need those interventionists that we talked about previously. It's one of the things I work very closely with our coaches our instructional coaches within the district who oversee our intervention program. And it's one thing that consistently I have been saying that I'm terrified of not having them in the operating budget just because of how are we going to make sure that our students are receiving the intervention that they needed really to continue to close that achievement gap. So if you want to go to the next slide. So then we look at how we're comparing to our neighboring towns and districts, neighboring towns and also our DART districts. So this is both neighboring towns and our DART districts. You'll see that we are pretty much along the same lines as others. We're kind of in the middle. We are achieving higher than the state, but again, when we talk about state achievement level, that isn't necessarily a place that we aim for. We always aim higher than the state. And you'll see in neighboring towns such as Sharon and Mansfield, their achievement in particular areas is higher, is improving at a higher rate. And we noted in the previous that their funding is very different than ours. If you want to go to the next slide. In grade 10, again, it shows a pretty much of a similar picture. We're sort of in the middle as far as achievement goes. You see some of the neighboring towns and some of the DART communities are performing at a higher rate, at a lower rate. This was just really information for information purposes. Again, you can pull this. I use the DART tool to pull this information, and it's accessible to you as well. So even if you wanted to look up another town, you can type in Easton and compare it to another town. It's a great resource for anyone.
Chrissy, just a question.
Sure.
So Easton math, red, looks to be about 70, close to 75.
Yep.
I just want to make sure I'm reading it. Looks like we're the third highest performing district in the entire list.
On this list, yes.
On this list?
Yes.
Got it. Just want to make sure I was reading it the right
Yep.
way. Because it feels, I guess the blue being ELA, less than, science, less than.
Yes.
Got it. So it depends. So it's specific
and it's year to year too, right? So
Right.
so if you think back to the line graph that was in 2 slides prior, you'll see that it goes up and down year to year. The other thing I want to point out is, could you imagine if we had the computer science PK through 12, the world language at the elementary level, what our scores would be when we're asking our students to use their critical thinking skills in those areas at a younger age. And again, I do think that it is up to the town to decide what do they want for the students, what do they want for our future leaders. I'll tell you what I want, but again, it's essentially what the taxpayers want to provide in what the funding would be for that.
Sure.
There's no question that we are a high achieving district, and that's because of the professionals that we hire when we compare ourselves to other districts. When we look at our own longitudinal data, we are stagnant. We know, because of the capacity of our students and the capacity of our staff, that we should be going through the stratosphere.
Sure.
So there's 2 different comparisons.
Yep.
To our neighboring districts, to ourselves.
Yep.
And this is our overall students, right? And Director Perez is going to get into some additional data that separates out our student populations.
Thank you. It's on?
No, it doesn't make
It doesn't
make
make
voice.
Okay, got it.
Table.
All right, got it. So as Assistant Superintendent Pruitt mentioned, I am going to highlight the student achievement or lack thereof of our marginalized population. And if you've ever, just to go back, because this is AP courses, but if you've ever seen an MCAS presentation from the school department, we do highlight the high needs area and students in special education, and they are not performing at the same level as their counterparts. And in this slide, we are highlighting that our marginalized population is not being recommended or taking the advanced placement courses, with the exception of the Asian population, at the same rate as their white student counterparts. And
Can I ask a question about that
Yep.
previous slide? Is that percentage of groups or
Yes,
is it
percentage.
number? Okay.
Percentage. Yep.
Does completion mean that they've just taken the class and completed the school year in advanced placement, or they received a passing score on the advanced placement tests?
Completion is the course,
Successful completion. 75%.
yes, not the AP exam. And even within the AP exam, if we talk about fees, AP exams cost money, and a lot of students, no matter the race, if they don't speak up and we don't know about it, because we do supplement where we can, then they don't take the exam. And so I wanted to also touch upon belonging data. This was the first time that we were able to sort of survey our students throughout the youth health survey. And so and that's taken every 2 years, and it starts at the 7th grade. So this was the data from EMS. This is not, this is the entire student body, not broken down by gender or race. But you can see that we are having some low numbers in our students feeling like they belong. And feeling like they belong goes back to what all of my colleagues have mentioned today. It's the extracurricular activities. It's the being in the cafeteria at lunch and not feeling ashamed if you are free and reduced. It's making sure that you're riding the bus in the morning so that you're ready to learn when you get to school. So it's all encompassing of the student experience as well as the academics. And so the next slide will show the OA data. And what I'm really excited about with these two slides is that we will now sort of be able to track our students in that way to see if what we are putting in place is working and our students are feeling like they belong. And then I think the last thing on my end is, again, with the last minute, we forgot to add the slide of the migrant population. That was one of the questions. And so I want to touch on that, and then I will add it to the final draft. We were not an EA or emergency assistance district that hosted the shelters, but we do have a lot of surrounding districts that did. That said, we cannot, by federal law and state law, ask an immigration status of a student when they register. So I do not have a definitive answer because we don't. But also, what I can say is that this year we have had a lot of new move-ins that are considered doubled up. And so that means that they've filled out an affidavit saying that they are living with whomever is the Easton resident. And for the purposes of DESE and the purposes of the federal government, they're considered McKinney-Vento. And you've also heard all of us talk about McKinney-Vento in a different department. That involves so much resources for each and every student, where the level of need, I don't think we know yet. So that's going to require, because the question also asked, what is the future prediction? And I don't think we know, because Easton was sort of late to the game. We weren't an EA. And as of August 2024, the governor did stop the EAs. So I can predict that there's sort of a moving population within those EAs, and it's just going to take a lot of partnering with our municipal departments like health to support all of our students.
So if the question on migrancy was related to whether or not it was consuming Easton's resources, is it safe to say, if it was, I don't know if it was, but I think it's safe to say they would show up in the headcount of pupils? And what we have seen is that pupil growth is occurring largely, to paraphrase, more because of Blanche Ames than it is regarding any change in migrant status. Is that
Correct.
a fair takeaway?
Correct. But yes, but the question was, do we have migrant students? And the answer is, I can't. We can't answer that.
Understood.
Yeah.
But I think what we can say is safely that the order of magnitude is not such that it is materially impacting our financial and fiscal performance and our ability to execute our curriculum, at least not via the numbers that we're seeing and the growth in the pre-K to attributable pre-K through 2, I think it is, through Blanche Ames.
Yep.
That's what's leading our growth in our district.
But our overall enrollment across the whole district is still down considerably,
Correct.
even
Correct.
though our population has increased
Correct.
significantly over the years. So,
Correct.
Whatever that number is, seems like it's negligible.
Correct. Correct.
Right.
Connor, you.
No, I just wanted to add some context without getting into, of course, identifying information that the EA program, folks may hear about this on the news, and that's kind of one of those things where, you can use as proxy as because Easton does not have an emergency assistance shelter that's contracted with the state, that would be a relatively de minimis issue. Not to say it's not important, but it's a very different context in a community with a large hotel with a state contract for emergency assistance sheltering.
I think the only difference for the purposes of this meeting and finances is that those districts that do have them do have a small reimbursement from the state the following year, because we were never designated as such. Even if we do have students, we won't get that reimbursement.
But at the same time, right, we also need the additional students to try to achieve some of the foundation formula, correct?
Increase enrollment, absolutely.
Increase enrollment.
Thank you.
So there was questions around staffing that we wanted to take this opportunity to answer. One in particular was around the student-to-teacher ratio. And so in front of you here on this slide, you'll see that we have a comparison chart for you of the student-to-teacher ratio from the towns that we have mentioned before, our neighboring towns and our DART towns. So you'll see that Easton has a student-to-teacher ratio, PK to 12.8 to students to one teacher. You'll see the minimum, the smallest student-to-teacher ratio is in Marshfield. Yep, 11.3. And then the highest student-to-teacher ratio is, that's supposed to be North Andover, sorry about that. That's 13.3 to 1. So we're again about in the middle range. We're actually on the higher end of this range. Yes, we're on the high. Yeah, we're besides Grafton, which is the same as us. There are 2 others that are higher than us that have the higher student-to-teacher ratio.
Tied for third highest.
Yes, thank you.
Lower the better in this scenario. For the
Yes, lower the better, yes. However, while that says that we are high, you'll see the line that we have shown here where we have decreased the student-to-teacher ratio over the past 10 years. So that's really important to note, is that we continue to strive to do that. And we are showing progress in that area.
And that speaks to hires too.
Correct.
So why are you seeing an increase in staffing? It's because you need to decrease the student ratio. In comparison to other districts, we're falling short. Of course, that that's a ratio, and so
Right.
it doesn't mean we have 12 students in the class.
Right, yes. The next slide, the question was around administrator, student to administrator ratio. Now, I do need to point out that the last time that DESE has updated this information was for the 2020-21 school year. So in comparison to other towns, this is where we are. Again, this number, the lower, Canton is the lowest right now, that they have the lowest number of, the lowest student to administrator ratio. I think when I looked at the actual numbers in 2021, it was 94-1. And then the highest is Danvers. So you'll see that we're kind of in the middle there as well as the student to administrator ratio. But again, this is not the current data. This isn't the past couple years of data, because the question asked for comparison to neighboring towns.
And we want to be
the
low. We want to be low on those.
Yeah, and the other thing to note about this too is that when we do gather this data, because we can go and I can ask all of those assistant superintendents the ratio, the administrator title is very different. Some towns include, for example, their athletic director, some do not. Some towns include that some towns have a MECO director, some do not. So the actual who the administrators are, whether they are counted, included or not included, is very different. So that's just something to note, especially in this particular student to administrator ratio, because it is a much smaller number of total number of staff throughout the district rather than naming teachers.
Connor?
So if I appreciate that, because similar to the town data sets are usually a couple years behind, but
Right.
Just looking at the school's budgets, I wouldn't expect that if you look forward into a few years that Easton's situation here dramatically shifts, right? It's not as if the schools have hired a dramatic number of administrative positions, right?
For the student to administrator ratio, correct.
Right, but I think that's important to reinforce, and also to show that this looks like it's pretty typical, right? So I think that's important because, folks, oftentimes when there's tight budgets, they look at town halls or they look at central admins and say, well, it's because there's too much mid-management. And I think that data like this is really, really important. And again, coming back to what we've highlighted a bunch, this is not, and it's a good thing, you get a bit of a time lag because of it, but because it's not just us calling our peers, where you don't have a controlled data set and a normalized data set, because your counterpart may call a position one thing and you may not.
Right.
That this is basically state centralized data.
Correct.
Verifiable data that folks can go look at for themselves.
Yes.
Right.
Yes,
So that's
absolutely.
really important.
And if you can just go back to that slide, I'm sorry. You'll also notice that when the yellow line is lower, that means that more administrators were hired. And so in the 2020-2021 school year, I just want to remind everyone also that that's when COVID hit, right? And so all the regulations came into play. There were many more, and we are now seeing, if I could make a prediction, I would think that number would go down again, meaning the student to administrator ratio, due to the number of compliance issues that are coming up that the schools have to report on, and the many mandated, as we showed before, the unfunded mandates that are being required as well, and all of the reporting that has to go to the state and the federal level.
I just have a question, just because of how Connor was explaining that. So reporting to the state, all of those communities have to report the same amount, or they report what they consider administrators?
They report what they consider.
So
Yes. Yes. I don't mean to
what we're
point my.
looking at is like apples to oranges to
Correct.
lemons.
Yes.
So we don't even know what everybody really is
Exactly.
putting in as administrators.
Exactly.
Okay. So like Canton could put a whole lot of people listed as administrators who we might not identify
Exactly.
as administrators.
Yes.
Okay.
Exactly. So this is the EPS staffing categories. I'm going to hand that over to Mr. Davidson to talk about this, as many increases and decreases fall within his department.
I think it's important to tie this page back to what we were talking about in district special education programming and some of our creative ways that we're meeting the needs of our students. You'll see within the columns the comparison from FY16 to FY25, and then you'll see the plus and minus of those departments. I think I want to definitely concentrate on the greens right now, especially around instructional support, special education and support, the SPED-related positions, and the medical and health services. When you look at that, those breakdowns are really supporting a lot of our programming. And you'll see increases in all of those areas, especially around the 9.9 increase in adjustment counselors and psychologists. We actually stayed level with psychologists over the previous years. Where there was a change was psychologists had a dual responsibility at one time, where they were overseeing special education team chair responsibilities and their regular part of their job. We transitioned, and you'll see in the Unit B contracts, to SPED coordinators throughout the district. There was a higher level of regulations that we needed to be following. There was a higher level of need happening within our buildings, and we adjusted based on best practice to meet the needs of our students and what the level of need was from a special education standpoint with compliance. And so you'll see those two areas of increase. Where you also see a increase is around nursing. Around the nation, it's appropriate to have 500 students to each nurse that you have within a building. As we consolidate our 3 elementary schools, we saw a need to start adding support within our elementary level. We had 2 nurses at the high school. We were out of, not compliance, but out of recommended regulations within our middle school and Richardson Olmsted. And so we increased our nursing services in those 2 buildings also.
Are there, for compliance purposes, are there fines or any teeth in those compliances, or is it suggested minimums?
It's a recommended for best service.
Okay.
500 students to each nurse. And so for us, the one thing that we're able to improve upon is also subs, right? And so when you have 2 in a building, you don't always have to sub out to replace 1 nurse. There's creative ways to meet the needs of your students within the building. So that's one way we've been able to financially balance what we're looking at. We've also been able to, we also had a much higher rate of students with high-level medical needs within buildings over the last 5 years or so. And so anything from diabetes to feeding tubes and a high level of need from those students to be able to be supported from an RN level. So there's a need for that increase just within our buildings alone on that part of it, and then also best practice being within those ratios. Around the SPED-related increases, you'll see the 3.97. Really, the ABA therapists and the BCBAs within our district, those positions are really supporting a lot of our programming within the district, and those tie back into some of those out-of-district costs that we were looking at from 2015. So bringing those positions in, being able to meet the level of needs of our students, increasing the opportunities within our district. Up top, if we go back to that, you'll see central administrators and administrators in general within the district. You'll see a little bit of movement just between those top 2 categories within Unit A and central and school administrators. It's been pretty level for the most part over the last 10 years. You'll see the department change was really 1 position. You'll see central office was close to 1 position there too. The last point I want to make tonight is really around the paraprofessional positions. You see a large increase there in paraprofessionals within the district. Multiple reasons for that. Again, we're bringing students back into district that have a specific level of need and support required, and so positions are added to not only operate our programs, but also meet the needs of students in their inclusive environments. So if we're pushing students into the general education classrooms and we're having more inclusive opportunities, we need to be able to support them in the least restrictive environment and provide the services necessary in any level of class within our buildings. You'll also see it identified here with preschool and K. We have a paraprofessional in every single kindergarten class to meet the needs of our landscape right now. And so that is above and beyond some districts, but it's also what we see as best practice. So some districts will split a paraprofessional between 2 kindergarten classes. Some will have a kindergarten para in each class. We have a kindergarten para in each. Another area within compliance is having our preschool classrooms with one special education certified teacher and one paraprofessional in the preschool. That's on regulations alone. Best practice, though, is to meet the needs of the kids and the level of need within those rooms. And so we have 2 paraprofessionals for each of our preschool classrooms. So as we've increased preschool opportunities and as we've increased kindergarten opportunities, you'll see a level of need that had a rise over the years. And so that's where your increase of 38.54 has happened over the last 10 years. Any questions on this slide?
I have a question, kind of a question and a comment. So perception is everything, right? So these numbers are really enlightening to me because it's not what I was expecting. I'm curious for the people who work in the schools, is this what you knew or are you surprised at these numbers?
Well, I think like when you look at the central admin, you think from 16 to 25, you know, I've been here a really long time. This is my 17th year, you know, but we used to have the 3 schools, so we had 3 principals. So we went from 3 principals to 1 principal and an assistant principal, you know, so yeah, the 2 principals then, and then the vice principal would be unit B, right? So I think like there's some bigger shifts that have happened along these times, you know, and then adding in the other adjustment council, like the guidance and library, like that has changed over time. Adding in another guidance counselor, adding in more adjustment counselors is definitely something we've been advocating for with the change over the last decade, probably even before COVID hit, with the introduction of cell phones and introduction at younger and younger age and the impact of that. So I'd say like there's definitely some things that feel a whole lot different from being on like boots on the ground type of mentality versus, and I think like as educators, like we're just looking for like, how can we get the most help the most faces in front of our kids to help support them the best we can.
Yeah. If I may, I also want to point out that in the student to staff ratio, that number is very, you know, right where it's a high number for our community. Right? And so while you might see the increases here, there's still room for us to grow, and the needs of our students are changing.
I think James had his hand raised. No, not at all. That's okay. I said that to Connor, not to you.
I was going to clarify, central and school admin means the principals that were previously at Murrow Hall, part of the 3 schools that have been closed. They've still remained on staff as principals, correct? From a pay perspective, at least. Because in the budget, it's 6 full-time FTE principals, but there are 4 schools. So I'm just trying to understand that from a budget perspective.
On what budget?
I believe it was fiscal 23, the last one where all the line items were available, or fiscal 24.
That would have been because if it was fiscal year 23, that was before Blanche Ames was.
Yeah, that was before.
Right.
Yeah, we also moved into Blanche Ames halfway during a school year.
Yeah. But could I actually ask a follow-up to maybe help contextualize, because it builds on Kathy's comment. Just to be clear, and perhaps Dr. Cabral, you can explain some of the staff reorganizing. I don't think I won't assign value to this and say, oh, that means everyone has everything they need. And that's certainly not what I'm taking from the district. As a fellow manager, when I look at this, what this says is, given the available resources, it seems pretty clear where they've gone. Setting aside 2 schools closed. So even if those were just net removes, so instead of plus 0.8, you would have a deduct of 1.2. So,
well, I just want to note, we're talking about the same number of students. So we closed 2 schools. That doesn't mean the kids went with them.
Right. No. And
so we're managing the same number. We're managing more staff and the same number of students.
Right. No. And I'm trying to be complimentary to that.
No, I know
support that.
I just when we not you, but when people say closing schools, I just want to make sure the public knows The kids moved into a bigger school.
Correct.
So we still have all of them. We didn't have a reduction of students in 2 schools.
Along surely with the business functions and administrative functions that come with a workforce that size and a student population that size. So I think that's really important to clarify. And this comes back to what I noted on in my own experience, just professionally and in my personal life about, when budgets are tight, folks look at administrative jobs. And so I just think that that's important to highlight.
I think this highlights the efficiency at scale as well, right? Like, this does a good job of showing that, maybe to your other point, like, what's the highest number on here? The line item that is in front of children, right? That is in the classroom with them every day, which is what you expect. It's what you'd want.
Right, which isn't proxy for, therefore sufficient to meet all the needs, right?
Exactly.
I think that these conversations, and I'll speak just for myself, can sometimes get tricky. You could look at this on a smaller scale with the town budget, where our total headcount growth in 5 years looks extraordinarily conservative. But some of that is because it is conservative, but some of that's because we dissolved an entire municipal function and regionalized it, right? There was cost savings there and things like that, but when that happened, that didn't mean, okay, well, so that's a 11 FTE cut, so the town should be at a 11 FTE deficit moving forward. That was, okay, we've made some progress here, we need to reallocate towards firefighters or health and community services, right? So I think that those things are important.
I think it's also important just to note that it's like almost a 10-year
For sure.
That's a good point.
span of time that we're looking at. So I'd be curious as to what the number would look like if it was the last couple of years, coming out of COVID, if we were looking at, instead of, COVID hit us hard, right, everybody? But if we were looking at like the 23 school year versus, as we start to get Blanche James and everything, and then looking at that change over a couple of years, because like 10 years it's a big span of time, and we've grown programs to pull those students back to not be out of district and have them in-house, which necessitated a lot of that in front of kids, but it's not necessarily in front of all kids, because it's like you're taking on those programs. So that's just a different way of kind of looking at it.
While those needs are elevated, which they are, as we noted, the overall population in that 10 years has decreased. So these are people serving less students. More.
And I also think it's important, I don't know if I got to it before I handed the mic over and sat down, but the instructional line. So if you look at the instructional line over the last 10 years, you have seen a decrease in our overall enrollment. It has started to swing back up since COVID, but we've added 21 teachers in that 10-year period too. So even with a decline, we saw the need to lower our class sizes and to be able to meet the needs of our overall population. I focused a lot on special education services tonight, but that's a key point to the big, grand scheme of this too.
And that matches the trend line of the student to teacher ratio, the
Right.
student to staff ratio.
Could you add context? So I'm glad that you touched upon the instructional, that's helpful, but also the role that paraprofessionals play, that's the other category that had material growth. Is that a philosophical, a policy change? How does that factor into the change?
It's a philosophical approach. When you look at it, if you're able to deliver services, high-level services at the youngest ages, over time, you should be able to create independence and close educational gaps and support students where their deficiencies might be. And if you're able to not only support them in the least restrictive environment, which we're really pushing towards that inclusive model in a general education classroom, then you're able to eventually see our numbers go in a more positive way where students are coming off of IEPs at a later date. If you look at, if we had broken down the numbers of IEPs per grade level, you see when students come in, they're roughly 16, 17% at Blanche James. They get higher right around third grade. That's across the state, across the nation. But then where we see a huge difference is when we're hammering home these services, you're seeing our special education numbers decrease over time. And so you're looking at the high school at the lowest numbers. I believe they were 14.5% last year. So philosophically, if you're able to meet the needs and provide that higher level at a younger age, you don't need to provide it at an older age.
And
So if we were tailing it back at the elementary level and maybe, not attacking it in that philosophical, ethical approach there, you might be looking at, okay, those paras or special education teachers are now needed at the highest level to make up for the efforts that we weren't doing at the lowest level.
Appreciate that. One follow-up
Youngest
question,
level.
just for the general public. Some might say, why didn't we just add more instructional as opposed to a parapro? Could you just compare those two in their skill sets and what they bring to the table, and why it wasn't just an additional increase of 59 instructors instead of 21 instructors and 38 parapros? Does that make sense? I'm assuming they do different things.
Pre-K and K.
Got it. Parapros.
Yes.
Yep. Yeah. Sure. And the ones that aren't?
Well, some are one-on-one aids and, right.
Yep. So they fundamentally do. So it's not necessarily for me that I'm asking this question, but for the broader public, so that they can appreciate that parapros are, I wouldn't call them specialists, but they do specialized things, whereas instructors do broader things to broader groups. Is that a very simple layman's? Please don't rely on me to make sure I get this right. So that's good. I'm seeing head nods.
Well, I would just offer from the perspective of the high school teacher, my paraprofessional is invaluable in my classroom. I couldn't do my job without her. So just speaking from my personal opinion, I need her to do my job, because then I cannot serve my students effectively if she's not in there with me. I think I would be in non-compliance if she wasn't there.
Said a different way, using the ratio perspective.
Yes.
You're saying that the improvement in the ratio of paraprofessionals to instructors is an overall beneficial thing.
Yes.
I see head nod, head nod, head nod.
And it's also based on what service is being provided. If it's a support within the classroom that meets an accommodation or potential slight modification, a paraprofessional can deliver that. If we're looking for a direct service related to ELA or math skills or a higher level of social prags, you're looking at a special education teacher, speech pathologist, adjustment counselor, school psychologist delivering that type of level of service. So it's all around level of service and what the students need. We do a great job of adjusting that on the fly at times, but also trying to be proactive in the budgeting process to meet the needs of our students in the least restrictive environment. If we're providing the highest level of support at all times, we're not creating that independence for that student to leave us at graduation or 22 to be a valuable member of our community upon graduation.
And part of the reason why I asked, just to add full context, is I do feel like we have a special sauce. I'm not sure what that is, but I think we get more from what we have for resources. I think the numbers somewhat bear that out. And so if there are things that we are doing that adds value to the different stakeholders, as a committee, we can raise that as an opportunity to say maybe that if we need to invest wisely, maybe there are areas that we're doing things right. I'm not saying this is one, I'm just trying to tease things out that have been clearly making us successful relative to the spend per pupil that we've been doing.
I totally agree with that. And I'd also like to look at it like the out-of-district students that we've had. Like if we look back to Mr. Davidson's slide from, I forget what year you had taken it when we had dropped it by, 30, 40 kids. It's not that those kids don't exist anymore. We still have kids that have those needs, but because of the increases with the adjustment counselors, psychologists, therapists, we are able to keep them, that's where we're getting the cost savings, is because we're increasing that. So we're no longer sending them out of district, which comes at a benefit to not only us with the budget item, but also for the kids and their experience within the school settings. Yeah.
James, I think you had your hand raised. Am I wrong?
Just
And
curious,
Nancy?
in the last decade or so, the net increase of central and school admin was 0.8, but I mean, haven't dug into the numbers, but DEI, HR, tech people, like what jobs I guess have retired or gone away from central school and admin, that there's only a net increase of 0.8 in the last 10 years?
The increases to central admin, we had 2 reduction of principals. We have a curriculum director, and we have human resources and DEIA are the additional.
So it took 2 out.
So it's almost a wash.
Yep.
Yeah.
You specifically mentioned the director of technology. That has always been a position in the district.
So less two principals plus the HR and
DEIA.
Thank you.
And director of curriculum.
Was it plus? No, was it always there, right? Director of curriculum?
Director of technology.
Shifted one of the principal positions became.
Oh, became that, that's right.
That was the wash
That's
part.
right.
Right, right, but one of the other principal positions was partly dedicated to MLL, right? So that was a 0.8, 0.2
Correct.
split. So that's where you get that fractional
didn't know that.
piece.
Was
I
that your question,
can't believe
Nancy?
that with a workforce that big, that you haven't had an HR person for that. For that period of time.
607 employees.
Yep. Yep.
Nancy, did you?
And
oh,
that's
so
what it
sorry.
was related to, just to, because I know people are curious about that, only one, and so thank you for just explaining those. I knew we were net down with two principals, but,
Good.
okay, thank you.
Time check, we're at 9:10. I couldn't tell if you earlier said 3 sections of 7 slides, or you said 3 slides.
17
So,
sections of 30 slides.
just thought I would do a time check and a math count.
We're on the last page.
Last page, gotcha, great.
We are answering all of your questions, so
You
shared
are.
ownership.
You are.
Maybe.
I think. If there are any that are missing, we need you to let us know. We can tell you about them at the next meeting if you want, but we don't want to leave any out.
Absolutely, appreciate that.
Andrea?
Thank you. So next slide, please. Next slide. Oh, there we go. Awesome. So this is to answer one of the questions that was provided on utility costs. I've only included fiscal year 24. As a reminder, we had a consolidation of our 3 elementary schools into 1 school in fiscal year 22 to 23. So if I do a look back, it's not going to be apples to apples. So I just decided I'm going to provide fiscal year 24. So this is an example of just one fiscal year across all different utilities for our campus. So gas, water, electricity, sewage, trash removal, telephone, and alarms, and our total cost. What I do want to touch upon, as Dr. Cabral mentioned, we've had the last winter and the winter prior have been mild winters. So we have baked in additional cost increase in our budget for fiscal year 25 that we hopefully will be able to meet the expectations within budget if we do have a more normal New England winter. So I want to move on to the next slide if there are no questions on this. We also had a question related to our maintenance costs for our campus. So this is a breakdown of what we paid in fiscal year 24, about $1.9 million across different areas, custodial services, our maintenance for our buildings, our grounds, our equipment, and our general upkeep of security. What I did want to bring to your attention, as Dr. Cabral had noted at the beginning of this meeting, was related to our DESI code or DESI chart of accounts. So on these last 2 slides, I've provided an example of the 4-digit code that we are using to identify our expenditures per DESI regulation. So the last 2 fiscal years, so fiscal year 25 and fiscal year 24, we did consolidate how we are presenting the budget line items. We have more than 700 expense lines in our accounting software system. DESI provides a little over 50 codes, so it is just a way to consolidate information, and we're presenting to a school committee as part of our quarterly budget updates in that same manner. DESI did have a chart of accounts update back in July of 2022. So just kind of framing that for fiscal year 22-23 when I came on, the first budget we set in that cycle is fiscal year 24. So it's really a consolidation effort just to present information in the same way we are required to report out to DESI on an annual basis for our school expenditures. I'm going to stop there to see if there's any questions on that. Okay. Awesome. Yep.
At one meeting, you indicated that it was the town people who did some of the maintenance on the schools.
That's correct.
And so does the money go from the school to the town, or?
So it depends on what it is. I think, correct
like
me if I'm wrong, Andrea or Dr. Cabral, if you go back to that slide, that DESI reporting, just looking at if you look at maintenance of grounds or buildings, I assume that's related to perhaps direct spend of the schools on supplies, services,
Correct.
or you do also have in-house maintenance custodians. DPW has the buildings and grounds division, and their budget is substantially larger than that, so I assume that's not what's reported there.
Right. We do not count anything that the DPW has in their budget. This is just our operating budget. We do pay for half of the town plumber We pay for half of the town HVAC. We pay for half of the town SRO.
And that's in here?
And also the seasonal maintenance.
And we also hire 10 seasonal maintenance workers every summer that do the maintenance on all of the grounds in town, of the town.
The half plumbers in this?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Is there any, I feel like I already know the answer to this, so apologies if it's simple, but has there been any material savings in the reduction of the 3 schools into 1, or is it essentially a wash from an energy and a heating and cooling standpoint because we're talking about a much bigger building?
It's the same number of kids, so the staffing's the same, of course, same services that we're providing. In terms of operations, there is a negligible, other than the $100,000 that we had in energy, because obviously you had schools that were sieving out heating, that were running on very inefficient boilers. However, you also had schools that had 1 electrical outlet in each classroom, and we were unable to use computers. We were unable to use assistive devices that were electric. So our electric costs have gotten much higher. We also went to a 1-to-1 through COVID, and so now we have students that are charging their computers every day. So the energy has been, the energy savings was big, but it has almost entirely been eaten up by the electricity costs.
Thank you.
Just to build on that, though, that's one of those important facets of, so Blanche Ames has an electricity bill that's very neatly attributed to Blanche Ames, but the town and the schools working together for a decade now have been mounting solar on everything we can, whether it's capped landfills or schools, to net out multiple 100,000 of what those otherwise would have been. So that's
That's why I asked about the Blanche James roof.
Okay, if there are no other questions, I'll move on to the next slide. So there was a question related to replacement costs for our Moscato turf, but just wanted to highlight a couple of factors for our school complex. So the total acreage is 89.82, and Tony, please correct me if I'm wrong in that. We are serving 4 buildings. The total square footage is $713,000. I'm sorry, not dollars. The wrong mindset as a finance director. 713,639 square feet. And just a reminder, on our school complex, we have our own wastewater treatment plant, and that for fiscal year 24 was about $122,000 in total expenses. As far as costs go, the initial installation for the Moscato turf was $749,000 back in 2019. Oh, replacement of Moscato. Thank you, Tony, for that. And then for as far as what our annual costs have been to maintain that, that's approximately $10,000 per year. We're expecting to need to replace that over 10 years, so 2029, as we indicated earlier. There was a question on the cost replacement between the artificial field and the natural field. So as far as replacement costs go, we have estimates ranging.
Those 2 numbers are switched. So that's the 2 numbers I told you I needed to switch. The replacement cost is between $52,000 to $57,000, and the maintenance costs are $44,000 to $48,000 per year.
Thank you. And then just one of the items we wanted to highlight, with a natural field use, there are other expenses that we want to also consider, right? So as on the slides, sprinkler systems, maintaining this, actually having personnel to be able to take care of the field, the pesticides, the fertilizer, the lost revenue if we're not able to actually host games on that field because it's flooded or because of inclement weather, and then transportation as well, and the rental use for the facility revenue. So I hope that answers that question that was out there.
It's difficult for us it's not apples to apples, obviously, and we would need to go out to bid and have experts do this, but just from our work in 2019, I think they said that the turf was about 3 times more usable than grass.
Yeah, that's what I recall, is that when the turf was initially installed, one of the stats that had been provided was that artificial turf can basically be used 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, versus natural grass. There's a lot of wear and tear, so it can be used about 1/3 of the number of hours that an artificial field can be. So, there's been, having the turf is provided, the artificial turf provides an opportunity for revenue, because you can, go from after-school practice to games to then renting it out to a youth league and then to have an adult league come in at night, where with natural surfaces, you just need to be much more judicious about scheduling. So.
Okay, thank you. Next slide, please. So we had a question related to some of our professional services and itemizing certain expenses. We have over 797 vendors. So if you would like an itemized listing, I thought a top 10 would be a better use of a demonstration of some of our costs. And this top 10 covers more than 50% of our total supplier expenses that was in that pie chart, the yellow shade and the other colors outside of the personnel costs. So as you can see, one of our top vendors is Lucini for transportation, both regular transportation and special services transportation, VHS, ADA, all transportation vendors. Then we get into our special services tuition expenditures, Eversource as far as gas, one of our third-party borrowers related to our electric utility leases that we have working with the town and cost savings with our solar on some of our buildings, WB Mason across the board supplies and materials, and then NRG, which is a direct energy gas utility provider. So $4.5 million out of a little over $8 million covered by just the top 10 vendors. I hope that answers some of the questions, but please reach out or ask if you want to see additional detail from some of our vendors that we use in the district.
The one part of the question was if we could compartmentalize them into different services. And unfortunately, that's not how we report it out. So we would have to go through the over 700. And it also gets tricky because some of the service providers provide different services to us. So we're not trying to not give you information. It's just that doesn't exist. If you would like to make a more specific request about a particular vendor or something like that, or the entire list of vendors, we could do that, but we don't have them in buckets.
Team, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that this slide A is more appropriate because it tells us the top spend, and it certainly satisfies my curiosity. I'm certainly not worried about vendor 762. I think this is exactly what we were trying to get at, Andrea. So I really appreciate you taking the question we asked, but more appropriately spinning it back in a way that we could digest it. I think for me, that whole the transportation is probably the biggest piece, and that was an open question I had. So I'm glad that you answered that particular one because it's a 25% of that other chunk, right? I think as a team, we talk about people. If you think about overall for all of our expense, people is the biggest, both the town or for the schools. So if you're talking 82% of their budget is people, then that's a people discussion, right? We can look at that slide and say, we're the parapros or we're the instructors. Like, is that matching with the values and the residents, what we're looking for, and are we giving the kids the right outcomes? So when I see this slide, it helps me appreciate that, well, you have to transport them. We can do it ourselves or not. We outsource it for a reason. For those of you that weren't there for that discussion, there's probably a lot of information available for why we did this and why it's better for us to do this. The special services tuition, I'm assuming that's the out of district, right? So, I mean, that happens by a very prescribed set of rules that have to be followed, that you have to, is legislated, that the school district has to execute. So for me, when you start getting down into 172 grand of WB Mason across the size of $60 million budget, roughly, right? 120, 50%, round math, fair. That, like,
just under 50.
Right, I'm not gonna count the paperclip, like where we have centralized printing. So I guess I'm just trying to weave together a lot of the commentary that we've heard from the team tonight to illustrate some of the big chunks that we're looking at. So this slide, Andrea, was perfect for me. Nancy?
I agree. I would suggest there might just be one follow-up that would be useful for people, and that is, what kind of leverage or play do we have in other providers instead of Lucini? Is there anybody else in town? I know you've gone through huge negotiations with them. That's the question that I sometimes hear. What are our other options? Are there any other options?
We go out to bid every time. We call vendors, we deliver bid packages to them, and we get one bid every year.
Guess who from?
That's what I've heard.
But I also feel Lucini is doing a good job.
They are. People just ask, you, if something got expensive in your home, you'd go see if there's another place to get it. And so that's a question I hear in the community.
No
and
shade on
just
the
wanted-
service. It's a matter of the service finds its best price based on the competition that the service has.
Well, yeah, so actually, could I do a procurement wonky thing here and make that point that with very limited exceptions carved out by state law. So when folks say, oh wow, the town's spending this on this service or the school's spending this, outside of the more de minimis spends, small 5-digit numbers, and I'm not saying de minimis in a personal household sense, of course that's not the case, but in a 9-digit organizational budget, you have to, with a limited exception, go out to competitive public bids. And if you proceed with an award, you don't have to award it, but so if it's a service you must do, you do the competitive bid. Whether you have 1 or 10 vendors, unless the lowest priced one has deficiencies, you have to, by law, award it there. So that doesn't mean you can just assume without question every service being paid is automatically the most efficient, but the law and an entire army of, there's literally an entire division of the state government, the OIG, that is devoted to ensuring that we are doing the right thing here when we bid these things out. In theory, to incentivize competition, whether folks respond, that's
right.
I can't go there, but that governs the overwhelming of any real meaningful service the town procures or the schools. That's whether it's paper or whether it's a $2 million transportation contract.
I think across both your points, though, you've both said it in different ways. We're talking about a $2 million expense in a budget that 82% of it is humanity, right? So even a significant uptick in this balance might get you a couple extra teachers, right? Might get you a small increase in the overall spend you can do on that human side, but that's the thing we're still looking at. Like these are significantly smaller aspects of the overall budget.
Can I ask if we could go back to the increase in personnel slide real quick? I'm sorry to go backwards, but I've been just kind of ruminating on it. I don't know if I have this question or not, but that's why I was just curious if like the unit B, like, because I think that is also an area where a lot of people kind of see them as administrators as well.
What's Unit A and Unit B, if I could ask?
Those are EEA members. So Unit A is a unit of EEA, the Easton Education Association, and Unit B is a unit of EEA.
Okay, thanks.
Yep.
Like it's like the SPED coordinator, and then it's like the vice principals and stuff, and the guidance director.
Guidance director and the director of nursing.
Those are all in B.
Correct. Mm-hmm. The majority, of course, are the special education coordinators.
Mm-hmm.
Sure. Kathy, are you good on this slide?
Yeah, I just was curious. Like I was curious about that because I
Sure.
hadn't seen it. But
That's okay. If we could go back to the other expense slide, and
Sure.
maybe the one after that, if nobody has questions. Good.
Okay. One of the questions that I was asked at the last meeting and was asked again in the list of questions that was sent to us was to quantify the budget targets. And so I want to highlight again that the budget targets are not, if we were able to fund some reactive needs, all of our reactive needs are met. If we were able to fund some proactive, all of our proactive. And obviously, we would not fund strategic needs without our proactive and reactive essential needs met. So we did quantify based on these items. For example, they're all things that we've been talking about. Again, remember that reactive or essential are things that we need as a reactive measure because needs are not being met. Proactive means we know that it's coming or everyone around us is advancing at a higher rate because we are not able to advance our offerings. And strategic are those things that we know we can do for kids. We have the capacity, we have the ability, we know that they're best practices. And with Andrea's help, we were able to come up with, just from that list, reactive and essential would be a 2.7 million increase. Proactive would be 2.4 on top of that, so that would be $5 million. And strategic would be 1.4, which would be a total of almost $6.6 million. That level service at the bottom, $53 million. If we have the exact same level of service next year, just rolling over our current staff and programs, it's 7.6% increase. That does,
I'm sorry, that's the loss of the grant support?
no.
No.
The loss of the grant support is an additional 3.6%.
You knew that question was coming up. It's like, funny you should ask.
She texted me, she's like, make sure.
No, I did not.
Only kidding.
So when,
Oh, look at the little red.
when we've been talking about for several years that this year is coming, we had this conversation right before COVID. The next year was going to be next year. COVID, I will never say was a beneficial thing for anyone, but with the influx of federal funding and lowered expenses by schools being closed certain days of the week, transportation not running, food not going, etc., it did buy us a few years. But we have been saying, and I'm saying again, you can see exactly where these numbers came from. You can see exactly where they're going without adding any of the reactive, proactive, and strategic. Just a level service next year is 7.6. If we are considering the things that we have, quote unquote, kicked the can and tried to find other very creative ways to keep them going as long as we can, it's an additional 3.6%. Now, that's also said without having negotiated any of the contractual bargaining units, which is all 3 are next year and 3 are the year after.
Just for context, what was your increase this year?
2%.
Thank you.
Well, on contracts you're talking about.
No, I'm saying
You're talking about school budget overall.
Oh, which one were you asking?
Okay, yeah, well, there's an important distinction there.
Yeah, right. School budget overall was
5.7
change. So even that's a good point, Connor. Like even just what was approved this year is still 2 points from level funding under 5 overall.
Correct, and also, and again, I say this I'm not assigning value to it. That 5.7 was the most substantial in nominal and percentage increase that the schools have received since the operating override in 2007.
It was 5.57. Sure.
And so even that is a level that is obviously not sustainable within Prop 2.5 and our state aid.
Right.
And so again, that's not a criticism.
Sure.
That's something that folks here, and I credit Dr. Burrell highlighting it. I think the point is to really try to drive that point home, that whether it's folks following the budget process along where we start every February with a projected deficit necessarily.
Yep.
But then find the money and find a way to make it work. That's not indicative of like sleight of hand. That's, reducing something over here, refining forecasts on the revenue side, understanding actual year-end data for utilities, and often, and what we have done, and what we made a lot of progress on, including with the district and including some hard budget years, on reducing our reserve spend in each year, that started to reverse in the current year we're in fiscal 25. And in doing so, we were explicit saying, this buys you a year. Right?
It is 9:30. We have a couple housekeeping items to do, and they've put up a very nice slide that says any questions. However, if I gave everybody one more minute to simply make a comment, then that would take about 20 minutes for us to get through.
I think we should just say thank you very, very much.
Absolutely. Couple things. One, if I could, not trying to stymie conversation, and I do want to afford, if somebody has a very important question that they believe some of the experts from the team here could answer for them now, please, I'd just like to, this is your chance, right? If we do address the school, when we address the school follow-up at our next meeting to start, I wouldn't expect all of the experts to be here. They may want to be here. You may want them here. They're absolutely welcome. But I also am very thoughtful about time and effort. So doesn't mean you have to, this is it. You can send us questions, we can engage, and we can certainly ask people. So does anybody have anything that they would really like to engage now in terms of a question? Fair, thank you.
No, he moved
Dottie,
on.
how do you
Sorry.
let
Just
somebody
because
in on
I
Zoom?
am in control of the panel here. There's somebody on an iPhone named Jackie that has their hand raised, and I'm not sure what I do from here.
Sure.
Well, can they put their question into the Q&A?
Yeah, I don't see a Q&A here, but there's a chat.
Chat.
Yeah, just put it in the chat.
Yep.
Jackie, if you could put your question into the chat, I will read it. Please include your whole name and your address for our minutes. We'll give you a
Great.
minute for that.
So the one thing I would say, team, is, and I will demonstrate my point. So I have done budgeting for 20 years now. So I have given the presentations that you've seen today and helped really share a narrative or develop an understanding for people with a lot of information and numbers. So I'm going to ask Craig, Chrissy, Andrea, and Dr. Cabral, if you could, just show me your cheat sheets. Show us your cheat sheets. So what I want to point out to everybody is that while we saw slides today, what you don't see, and I picked up on it, is that they all made notes around the issues. And so the reason why I share that is, right? Fair. Oh, Carol, see? We all got them. Love it. Right? So the reason why I bring that up is when I receive information, I actually think about the source, and I want to understand, do they actually understand their information? Are they sharing everything with me? Do they know it at a depth that I feel comfortable that if there was something that stood out, they would share that? And their analysis is helping me make informed decisions. And when I see people, so this is if you were ever going to work for me in the general public, when I see people who take the slide, they add their notes, the commentary, they're not reading the slide, they're sharing with you the story that that slide tells. And I just want to thank you all, because to me it shows how much you actually prepared. That is an incredible amount of effort. It's not just make the slide, gather the information, put it down, but what are the issues or questions that somebody might ask me around this? How does it fit into what I'm trying to share and what the committee is trying to accomplish for its charge? And so that may seem like a little thing, but I can tell you in my FP&A world, that's a dead giveaway as to whether or not somebody knows their material. So I think on our behalf, as Nancy said, we just want to say thank you so much. We know that you have an incredible day job. Kids are in school, you're impacting and molding people's lives. And for you to come and share what you did tonight was a lot. It was a tremendous amount. So just thank you all so much. I don't know if it's appropriate for us to clap.
Can I just chime in?
Please.
I had the privilege of having a view into the work that was being done as it was being done. So access to some of the data sources that were shared as the team was, and it was just a constant flow of information happening among these team members over the past couple of weeks. And this is material that you could give it a week-long workshop on it, and they'd still have stuff to talk about at the end. There is the depth of information that's available, and the knowledge that this team has and can bring to it, and the ideas. And I think a lot of the work was just paring it down into something that was digestible. And to only tell the story in only 4 hours was a real challenge, because there's just so much there to it. It's so complex, and they know so much and want to really, really help this group and the public understand all of this information, because it's a lot of taxpayer money that we're deploying to service a lot of students and working with a lot of staff to get that done. So it's incredibly important, and you guys always blow me away, but getting that window into seeing some of the day-to-day work coming together over the past couple of weeks just was super impressive. So thank you for everything you did. I know there were a lot of late nights, early mornings, skipping lunches, and clearing your calendars. So we really appreciate it.
Thank you all. Did you want to just share the question that Jackie may have asked? Or has it not come in yet?
The chat isn't working.
Got it. So Jackie, if you can't get it in the message or the chat, perhaps you could, is there a way for us to receive emails?
Yeah, they could email it to me. I don't know if they'll do it instantaneously, but if we
No,
can't
that's okay.
answer it tonight, we can have a follow-up and have it at the top of the next meeting, but my email is cread@easton.ma.us.
Thank you so much. And so we'll do that. We'll address the question at the next meeting. And Jackie apologized for the chat issue. So we have a couple other items. I don't want to keep these people too long, but I am going to give some outtakes I would have saved for the end, just because I think it would be helpful if they heard it. So for the team, just some thoughts that I wrote down for us to think about that I picked up from Nuggets. What do you get? Values and outcomes. So James, I thought you asked a really good question in terms of wants versus needs. And I think that's just something we all have to think about. I think Dottie had a great point that in many cases there are a tremendous amount of conversation that the team has put in regarding things like kindergarten. That wasn't a short-term thing. That was a multi-year discussion and very intelligent people trying to solve for what we heard from the values of the community. But wants versus needs were, I think, going to be an important discussion. I don't know about you, but you used the word digestible, and I'm definitely going to be digesting for a while. So what I want to acknowledge is that I wrote down 240, 262, 274, DESE, Fed regulations, state regulations. If we did this, it was 38,000 hours to meet these minimum staffings. And so I just want to say to the team, if you're feeling overwhelmed, I think you should. I am, because what I'm trying to weed out is how much of this do we have to? Like, if we're not satisfying what the state tells us or what we have to satisfy, then we have to go satisfy it, right? Like, all of these different things are new to me, I guess. So it's a lot. So I would just encourage everybody to go back. If you have 4 free hours, rewatch this maybe. But the information that's on the website is huge. A lot of the slides you saw tonight are absolutely in the budget. They might have been updated for tonight, but they're things that were talked about last year at the budget process, the year before that. This isn't an entirely brand new architecture that was created in terms of reactive all the way to strategic. So there's just a lot of information out there. I would encourage you to do your homework. Yeah, the complexity of the regulations to me was just a little bit overwhelming. Like, it's just one of those things where you get into it and you learn it, but if you're not in it every day, it can be hard for me to, I guess, understand that and translate that into impact and bodies and expense and value and all that good stuff. So I did want to thank the educational component of our team, because hearing direct feedback about the role that a paraprofessional plays in the educational environment is huge. I don't know if that's good or bad, crazy or wacky, and adds value, but to hear you folks add that it does add value, that enables you to do your job, that enables us to satisfy specialized requirements that have developed over time, those are things that I don't know from my background, if that makes sense. So I just want to thank you all for participating actively to help me understand more how these things work together. That was it from an educational standpoint, just in general, which I think is fair since several people from the school are actually on this committee. So we are at the halfway point. So halfway point of any team, I make the same statement. I ask for all of you to raise your hand now to me privately, not now, but via a text message, via a phone call, to say if something is not working. If things are not transparent enough, Chris, I need you to call me, because we have X number of meetings left to get you there, get us there. It's an important concept. If we don't understand, James, certain details of needs versus wants, I want you to call me. If these sessions aren't helpful, I want you to call me, because we have 2 or 3 more meetings, maybe 1 or 2, before we need to start talking work product. And I would argue, just my assessment, we're 1.5 meetings behind, probably. I would love to have, through nobody's fault, let me clarify, meaning incredible amount of information today. I'm probably going to need this entire time before our next meeting to understand what it meant and how do we lever it? Do we lever it? Is there opportunity here? Is there risk here? And that's not because the presentation wasn't good. It's because you did in 4 hours what I would like to have a week seminar on. And so I can just imagine everybody else feels that way, but I do want to instill a sense of urgency. So when we leave tonight, one of the homework things is if you are not getting out of this committee what you'd like, I need to know that now, because we only have 1 or 2 meetings to course correct to get you that. And I'm absolutely committed to getting, hopefully all of us, but as many as possible, to feel like their participation in the committee is valued, they're getting from it what they wanted, and we can develop work product from it. Is that fair? The other homework is digest this, and if you have more questions for the schools or thoughts or items that were prompted, first I would ask you, how can I answer this myself? Go to the resources. And then that way you can ask the question and answer it and share it with the team as work product, rather than here's my list of questions. So I'm flipping the paradigm. I gave everybody the first bite at ask your questions. Now I'm giving everybody first bite at ask another question and answer it yourself if you can, so that you can share the benefit of that question with the team and the work product, if that makes sense. Is that fair? Cool. Yes, ma'am.
Could I also ask, before the last meeting, or at the last meeting, you asked people by a certain date to have the questions so we can make sure we had information prepared?
Yes.
Can we set a date for questions just to make sure we're bringing the right information and potential graphics to answer them?
Definitely. Monday, I think, is when we set last time. It gives people the work week and then a weekend to digest. And if everybody could get me their feedback by Monday, that would be great. Is that okay? That work in terms of timeline? Because it's a quick meeting. The next one's October 23rd. Appreciate it. Yep. And I would just say to the team, so as with all of us, credit to Andrea, if we ask a question and you folks are like, look, you asked this, that's not valuable. I believe I can give you all the value with this. Just shoot me an email if you're uncomfortable and you don't want to make that decision, because I would have made the exact same decision you made tonight. That to me is managing up and managing us. You know, we shouldn't just feel like we get to ask any question. You folks should have input as the experts about how you want to reply to it to help us learn the best way possible. Oftentimes people who don't know ask a question that gives you 800 lines and you really are like, we could talk about that, but here's the 10 that we really want to spend time on. Anybody else, I guess, thoughts? Well, we have this team here because I don't know if they need to review the minutes with us. I think that's like a level of hell we don't need to put everybody through. They've already spent a long day at work and a long day with us. Good? Awesome. Thank you guys so much, honestly.